46 years ago, a young man in New Orleans vanished in the alley right behind his own house, disappearing without a trace, leaving his family devastated and the community bewildered, unable to understand what had happened. Authorities quickly suspected someone close to him, a person who had had a minor disagreement with him before, but with no body found, no clear evidence, and only very scant clues to go on, the investigation completely stalled. Yet throughout all those years, the victim's family never once gave up hope, clinging to the slim chance that he was still out there somewhere, or at least that the truth could still be uncovered. Then one day, when the old case file was reviewed again, after nearly 3 decades, a detail overlooked from 1980 suddenly emerged, a tiny detail that no one could have imagined would overturn the entire case, and shock everyone involved in a way no one could have foreseen. Before we dive deep into this dramatic story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you like this video, don't forget to hit subscribe. New Orleans in the summer of 1980 was steeped in humid heat, thick with the smell of Mississippi River mud and steam from the swampy canals surrounding the city. By day, the scorching sun cracked the pavement in spots, while at night, the moisture settled quickly, as if someone had opened a door straight into the heart of the bayou, making the air thick and the scent of rotting grass seep into every crevice. The city was in a tense period. Crime was rising, the police force was understaffed, and many poor neighborhoods existed in a state of constant unease. The lower Ninth Ward, where the Turner family lived, was one such area, familiar yet quick to vanish into darkness just a few blocks away. Elias Turner, 25 years old, a printer at a small factory in the eastern part of the city, was the kind of person neighbors easily remembered: quiet, punctual, steady in his job, and always greeting people as he passed by. He lived with his mother and his 17-year-old younger brother in an old wooden house right off a narrow street leading into the neighborhood. Elias's habits were as reliable as the rhythm of the printing press at his workplace. Off work at 5:30, dinner, a shower, then sitting on the front porch steps for a bit to get some air before locking up and going to bed. Habits like that, when suddenly broken, always cause more unease than people expect. That night, around 9 p.m., the neighborhood was bathed in the dim yellow glow of streetlights and the steady hum of air conditioners from the tin-roofed wooden houses. Elias was leaning back against a porch post, gazing at the empty street, while sipping from a glass of cold water still beaded with condensation. A neighbor passing by greeted him. Elias smiled and nodded. Neither of them knew that was the last time anyone would see him in such a peaceful state. Around 9:20, Elias stood up, set his glass down on the step, and walked into the alley beside the house, a narrow path leading to the back of the neighborhood, where it was usually breezier and quieter. No one knew what he intended to do there. His mother assumed he was just stepping out to look at the night sky or get some cooler air, as he often did. But from that moment on, Elias's figure seemed to dissolve into the thick darkness between the 2 rows of old houses. By 9:40, his mother noticed the light in Elias's room was still off. She stepped out onto the porch and called his name, her voice cautious but not yet fully worried. There was no response. Elias's younger brother grabbed a flashlight and circled the backyard, shining it along the wooden fence, hoping his brother had just gone to a nearby neighbor's house. But 10 minutes, then 20 minutes passed, and every familiar corner remained silent. From 10 p.m. to 10:40, the family split up and searched in all directions within a few hundred meters. The empty lot behind, the abandoned warehouse at the end of the street, the fenced corner where kids often gathered. They called Elias's name repeatedly until their voices grew hoarse, but no one answered. The feeling of something wrong at first, like a sharp needle pricking the skin, gradually turned into a cold metal plate, pressing on their chests, making everyone gasp for breath. Not a single footprint, not a sound, not even a note left behind. Elias had seemingly evaporated from the face of the earth. By nearly 11 p.m., when every reasonable possibility had been ruled out, and the house sank into the heavy silence of anxiety, His mother stood trembling in front of the wall-mounted phone, her hands drenched in sweat, her eyes wide with an unnamed fear. She picked up the receiver, dialed each number in the thick silence, as if each beep pulled her further from her last slim hope. On the other end, the duty officer's voice came through steadily. "New Orleans Police Department. How can I help?" She took a deep breath, trying to suppress the sob rising in her throat, then said slowly, haltingly, "My son, Elias. He's missing. We can't find him anywhere." A few minutes later, when the call was logged as a missing person report from the lower Ninth Ward, the night shift at the New Orleans Police Department received the information with a familiar, almost numb reflex, similar to the dozens of similar calls they handled each week. In 1980, handling a missing person report still relied on large yellow paper forms clipped to a board and filled out with ballpoint pens. Everything was slow, manual, and without the electronic systems that came later. The duty officer noted down the name Elias Turner, male 25 years old, the time reported missing, a basic description of his appearance, and the information provided by the family. The procedure at the time was fairly simple. Determine if the missing person had clear risk factors like being a minor, having a medical condition, or signs of crime. If not, the case was classified as one to monitor, but not high priority. The report was passed to 2 patrol officers near the area for a basic scene check. Around midnight, a white and black Ford LTD patrol car turned onto the narrow street where the Turner house was. The headlights swept over the potholed road, across the wooden fence and the peeling walls from constant moisture. The 2 officers stepped out, one young, 3 years on the job, and one older, who had experienced the crime surge in New Orleans during the 1970s. They carried long maglite flashlights, notepads, and a quick note form. The Turner family waited on the porch, their eyes weary from nearly 2 hours of fruitless searching. The mother hugged her arms to herself, while Elias's younger brother stood at the edge of the front yard, eyes fixed on the dark alley where his brother had disappeared. After quick questions about when Elias left the porch, which direction he went, and how long the family had searched on their own, the police began surveying the area. They shone their lights down the narrow alley between the 2 rows of houses. The pale yellow beam glided over moss-covered wooden walls, damp dirt ground, and uncollected trash bags, a common sight in the neighborhood. The flashlight scanned every crack in the bricks, every small pile of debris, but nothing stood out. No strange shoe prints, no dropped items, no scratches or drag marks. It was just an old, dark, damp, and silent alley, as it had always been. The older officer checked the area behind the house, a narrow backyard, loose wooden fence, with hard-packed mud below. He lowered his flashlight to examine closely, but the ground showed no recent disturbance. If Elias had walked through, his footprints would overlap with dozens of old ones from family and neighbors, making it impossible to distinguish anything clearly. They circled out to the main street, where the dim streetlights cast shadows over puddles that reflected nothing but silence. Traffic had thinned, and aside from faint radio sounds from a house at the end of the block, there was nothing to suggest a struggle or unusual disturbance had occurred between 9:20 and 10 p.m. After nearly 40 minutes of surveying, the 2 officers returned to speak with the family. They asked again about basic details. Had Elias ever run away before? Did he have debts? Any conflicts with anyone? Did he often leave the house at night? His mother shook her head to most questions, and his younger brother confirmed Elias had never gone anywhere without letting them know. The police noted everything but did not view any detail as evidence of crime. By the standards of the time, an adult could leave home for many personal reasons, and without evidence of danger, authorities always logged the case as monitor. Finally, they filed a preliminary missing person report, noting the time Elias left the porch when the family began searching, his build, the clothes he was wearing, and concluded no immediate signs of criminal element. They advised the family that if Elias did not return within 24 hours, to come to the station to add information and upgrade the file to official missing status. As the patrol car pulled away from the narrow street, its headlights sweeping across the porch one last time, passing over Elias's glass of water still in its place, the condensation long gone, leaving only a silent void, as if confirming no one knew where Elias had gone. How far, or how? In the internal notes of that night's shift, the case was classified as routine missing, a file where every detail was too calm to suggest foul play, and that very calmness left an unspoken unease that no one could name. After the police car disappeared down the street, the Turner house had no further official presence from authorities. The night was late, but no one in the family could sit still. The chirping of insects outside provided a steady backdrop to the anxiety spreading through the rooms. Nearly half an hour later, with the family's panic growing more evident and no new information, the dispatch center decided to send another support team back to the area for a limited search around the neighborhood. A step more for reassurance than investigation, as at that point, it was still viewed as an adult temporarily leaving home. Under the dim flashlight beams sweeping over the still dewy ground, the initial search team started from the Turner backyard. The yard was only about 20 paces wide, surrounded by an old weathered wooden fence. Elias's younger brother led the way, shining his flashlight close to every corner wall, every clump of grass, hoping for even the smallest sign, a clear footprint, a note, a fallen item, anything to explain why Elias left the porch and didn't return. But everything looked just like every previous night, quiet, familiar, and empty. The two officers checked the fence for any broken, loose, or stranger oversigns, but the planks were all old, with mottled rot, impossible to tell new from old marks. When they turned the lights to the ground, the hard-dried mud showed no unusual depressions. If Elias had come out here, his footprints had blended into the web-like old ones from family members who often went out back to cook, fix things, or change the dog's water each evening. The search team moved to the narrow alley where Elias had entered at 9:20. This was the most eerie area. The two rows of wooden houses close together formed a corridor so dark that streetlights from the front couldn't penetrate. The older officer raised his flashlight high, shining along the slightly leaning wooden walls, then lowered it to the dusty ground covered in dry leaves. There were no disturbances vague enough to suggest anything. The group stood for a moment, listening for any unusual sounds, footsteps, the drag of something heavy, even the slightest. But there was only the light breeze rustling tin roofs, and faint metallic clanks from somewhere, as humidity caused them to bump. The family split up along the edges of each house, shining lights even under the wooden steps. Elias's mother called his name again, her voice weak enough to blend into the night. The police listened and noted, but what they gathered was only a chill running down their spines, not from fear, but from the absolute perfect silence. The two officers decided to expand a few dozen meters to the dirt path behind the neighborhood, a small trail leading to old storage sheds and overgrown grassy lots where kids sometimes gathered to play ball during the day. Flashlights shone on rusted tin walls, the light reflecting in pale spots. They examined each shed door closely, every wall section, every abandoned item. The younger brother, trying to stay calm, stared intently at the distant shadows, as if waiting for a figure to emerge. But every effort led to the same result. No direct signs, no forgotten items, no unusual trails, no new footprints, no cries, no objects underfoot. In the thick, humid New Orleans air, sounds were quickly absorbed, making the search even harder. Flashlights only illuminated a limited distance. Beyond that was pitch-black darkness swallowing everything. The lack of equipment from that era, no thermal detectors, no helicopter support, no tracking technology, meant police relied only on their eyes, flashlight beams, and instinct. And their instinct, at least at that moment, revealed nothing unusual. After nearly an hour of sweeping, the younger officer turned to his partner and shook his head slightly. Both looked back at the Turner family, faces anxious to the point of collapse at any moment. The older officer said, in a gentle but clear voice, "We don't see any signs of a struggle or criminal activity here. Maybe Elias just went somewhere for a bit. He'll probably be back in the morning, though meant to reassure. His voice betrayed a hidden weariness. It was a line New Orleans police had to repeat many times in the 1980s, when limited resources forced them to prioritize missing cases and classify most adults as voluntary departure, unless there was clear evidence otherwise. They added a few more lines to the file, asked the family for a detailed description of Elias's clothing, and advised leaving the porch light on all night, in case he returned. As the patrol car left, leaving the night to quickly close in, as if no one had ever walked through that alley, the Turner family stood silently, in the faint light spilling from the house behind. They tried to cling to the police's reassuring words that Elias might have just stepped out for a while, that he'd return by morning, but none of them truly believed it. The alley remained pitch black as the moment Elias entered, 20 meters of bare ground revealing no disturbance, and that absolute emptiness, no traces, no sounds, no tangible clues, was what made the fear deeper, weighing on every breath they took through the long sleepless night. By the next morning, when the first rays of sunlight pierced through the thick, humid mist characteristic of New Orleans, and shone down on the old tin roofs in the neighborhood, the Turner family was already standing in the front yard, waiting for the authorities to return and begin a wider search. No one in the house had been able to sleep after a night of weary, hopeless waiting for Elias to come home. Every car passing on the main road, every sound from the neighbors made them reflexively turn their heads, but the front door remained silent, with no sign of his return. When a new police team was dispatched that morning, they arrived with daytime flashlights, notebooks, and a more cautious attitude than the night before. Though on paper, the case was still classified as a missing person, without signs of criminal activity. However, procedure dictated that if the missing person did not return after 12 hours, the search radius had to be expanded beyond the residential area. In the context of 1980, expanding the radius by 1-2 miles around the scene was considered the most critical step to determine whether the missing person had left the neighborhood or was being held in some remote spot. The limited police force from the district gathered at a vacant lot near the Turner home, where they used paper maps to mark out the areas to be swept, an unfinished construction site about a mile to the east, the empty lot behind St. Claude Church, and especially the container parking yard, where old tractor trailers were frequently parked and active throughout the night. The search team was divided into 3 directions. The Turner family stayed in the central area to identify any clues that might relate to Elias. The police brought additional high-powered flashlights and scene markers. Although it was not officially treated as a criminal case, they documented every step according to procedure in case the situation became more serious. The first destination was the construction site, right on the edge of the swamp, an area with lots of abandoned materials and rarely used paths. The ground there was covered in truck tire tracks, footprints, and patches of unset concrete, creating a chaotic maze that made identifying fresh traces extremely difficult. The officers walked along the perimeter of the site, shining lights on the soft patches of earth from the night dew, but everything was obscured by overlapping old marks. There were no unusual indicators, no dropped objects, no drag marks, no torn pieces of clothing. They continued to the vacant lot behind the church, a place that had once been a small park, but had been abandoned for years. Overgrown bushes formed dozens of dark corners, forcing the police to use sticks to push the thickets aside. Here, one officer spotted a few footprints deeper than normal, but their trail disappeared into the thick grass. It was impossible to determine if they belonged to Elias or to the teenagers who often gathered there. Still, the discovery began to create a sense of unease that hadn't been there before. As the sun rose higher, the search team moved to the third area, the sprawling container yard, covering several acres, located near the highway leading out of the city. From a distance, the stacked metal containers formed silent, cold walls, their surfaces reflecting light like giant eyes, watching every movement. This was a place where many drivers parked overnight, despite the lack of strict management. The officers spread out, checking around each row of containers, shining lights under truck chassis, even lightly knocking on a few doors to ensure no one was inside. When one officer aimed his flashlight at the area near the western fence, the beam reflected off a small silver object lying in the dirt. He bent down to pick it up. A metal keychain, worn smooth from rubbing, but still clearly engraved with the initials, E.T. The Turner family had previously mentioned that Elias used a keychain with his initials, a birthday gift from a few years back. This coincidence immediately changed the atmosphere. The officers examined the item closely. No bloodstains on the surface, no unusual scratches beyond normal wear. However, its appearance in an area more than a mile from the Turner home, and not on Elias's usual route, was noteworthy. They marked the location with a wooden stake and recorded it in the file as an item found related to the missing person. Although it couldn't yet be considered criminal evidence, the officers began speaking in low voices, discussing the possibility that Elias had truly gone far from the neighborhood or been taken there by someone. What made them more cautious was the distance and the nature of the container yard, a place no one would normally enter without a reason. The older officer prudently ordered a thorough sweep of the surrounding area, and in the next few minutes, they found another faint shoe print in the dirt, not clear in shape, impossible to accurately size, but enough to raise the question, was this Elias's shoe or someone else's? The police began questioning the yard manager, but he just shook his head. No log for vehicles entering or leaving. No night staff. Everything operated informally. In 1980, yards like this weren't tightly regulated, making them perfect spots for someone to come and go unnoticed. The moment the keychain was placed in an evidence bag, the nature of the case had changed. The initial notes of no signs of foul play were no longer certain, though the younger officers still suggested Elias might have dropped it while going with someone or coming there himself. His older colleague remained silent longer than usual before offering any opinion. That silence, for the Turner family, who were watching every police action, was enough to make them understand that the case was no longer being viewed as an adult voluntarily leaving home. As the search team packed up their equipment, it was already midday, with Louisiana's sun pouring down on the containers, making the metal surfaces hot enough to glow. But amid all the ambiguity and tension, one thing was very clear. The appearance of Elias's personal item in a place he had no reason to visit had opened a new direction. And for the first time since the case was reported to the police, someone said aloud what everyone had been feeling. Something's wrong. Very wrong. As soon as the information about Elias's keychain being found at the container yard reached the officers on duty, a small part of their thinking began to lean toward the possibility that this was no longer a simple missing person case. And it was at that tense moment, while the Turner family and the police were still debating the next search expansion, that a neighbor living 2 houses down from the Turners unexpectedly approached, his voice low but trembling in the way of someone who had been pondering all night whether or not to speak up. That person was Brian Talbot, 42 years old, a night shift laborer at a construction site in the eastern lower 9th Ward, known for being quiet and only speaking when absolutely necessary. Brian said that on the evening Elias disappeared, sometime after 9:20, he had seen 2 figures in the alley, right in the path Elias had taken. That statement made both officers stop immediately. Brian wasn't the type to meddle in others' affairs, nor the kind to exaggerate stories, so his voluntary report drew more attention than usual. The younger officer opened his notebook and asked, "What exactly did you see?" Brian stood with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the alley, where daylight now shone in but seemed to retain the thick darkness from the previous night. He explained that he had been walking home from the bus stop after his shift, around 9:30 to 9:35. As he passed the alley entrance, he caught a glimpse of 2 figures moving inside, one walking quickly, one standing as if waiting for someone. He didn't hear voices, didn't hear footsteps, just saw movement. But that was all his memory retained. The police pressed for more details. "Did you recognize their builds? Tall or short? Male or female? Light or dark skin?" Brian shook his head. The only light reaching the alley at that time was from a street lamp about 25 meters away, partially blocked by old tree branches, casting only weak patches of yellow light, insufficient to reveal any faces or details. Even Brian wasn't sure if the two figures were close together or a few steps apart. He only knew that in the moment he glanced over, there was movement. It all happened in no more than 2 seconds. To verify the statement, the older officer led Brian back to the spot where he said he had seen the scene. They stood at the point he had paused the night before, measuring the distance to the alley entrance, estimating visibility under nighttime lighting conditions. What they recorded wasn't very promising. The observer's position was more than 30 meters from the alley mouth. The only light came from a dim street lamp filtered through long branches. Under those conditions, any figures would appear as vague dark shapes rather than distinct forms. The younger officer walked into the alley for Brian to assess identification potential. But even in daylight, Brian admitted the distance was too great to confirm builds, let alone identify anyone at night. When asked if he was certain the two figures appeared exactly when Elias entered the alley, Brian couldn't confirm. He said he didn't remember the exact time because he wasn't wearing a watch. He only estimated based on his usual shift ending at 9 o'clock. If the bus was late, he might have passed by at 9:40 or later. That time frame overlapped with when the Turner family began panicking and searching for Elias. But it was just coincidence, not enough to confirm anything. Still, the question raised by this statement lingered. While Elias entered the alley alone, was someone else there at the same time? If so, who were they and what did they do? The police recorded Brian's entire statement in the file: estimated time, observation position, description of lighting, viewing angle, level of subject identification. They even noted that Brian showed signs of fatigue from night shifts, and that memory could be affected by poor lighting, tiredness, and the passage of time. In 1980, New Orleans police had no techniques for reconstructing scenes with lighting, no software to simulate witness visibility. They only had the most basic tools: a piece of paper, a pen, and subjective judgment based on experience. And the older officer's experience told him that any statement with too many vague elements needed to be treated with distance. Therefore, although they recorded Brian's statement, both officers did not consider it a significant clue. They viewed it as reference information, potentially useful, but highly prone to error. The reliability of witnesses in low-light conditions was always an issue, especially in an era without standardized statement evaluation like later years. In his notes, the younger officer even wrote, "Nothing unusual seen. Witness unable to determine gender, number, or build." But what they underestimated was the essence of the statement, not the identification value, but the existence of movement in the alley, where there should have been only Elias. Although the police did not officially declare it, the Turner family clearly sensed that the emergence of a neighbor's statement about figures had changed the atmosphere. Elias's mother asked repeatedly what it meant, but the officer only replied, "We can't conclude yet. It could be neighbors taking a shortcut or someone passing by." The answer sounded reasonable, but it didn't explain the suspicious coincidence between the time Elias vanished and the appearance of the two figures Brian saw. When the police left, adding a few supplementary lines to the file and promising to return if needed for verification, Brian stood watching them go and then sighed. He didn't know if what he saw was truly important or just an illusion while walking in the dark after an exhausting shift. But he clearly felt one thing: if those figures really existed, and if they were connected to Elias's disappearance, then the fact that he only saw indistinct shadows was the most frightening part. Because in a narrow, dark alley like that, anyone appearing without leaving a trace was a mystery, and that possibility now loomed in a way that shook all the police's previous assumptions more than ever. On the morning of the second day after Elias disappeared, when the missing person file had begun to thicken with scattered and contradictory notes, the police were forced to create a preliminary hypothesis analysis table to determine the next investigative direction. Although the case was not yet officially classified as involving criminal elements, the discovery of Elias's keychain at the container yard and Brian Talbot's vague but hard-to-ignore statement made it impossible for them to continue treating it as a case of an adult voluntarily leaving home. Three major hypotheses were discussed in a small meeting among investigating officers and patrol personnel, each with strengths and glaring weaknesses. The first hypothesis, that Elias left home on his own, was put on the table first due to its simplicity and because it was the direction the police most wanted to believe. Under 1980 missing person procedures, an adult had full right to leave their residence without notifying anyone. Elias was an independent young man with a stable job. In theory, he could have changed plans, gone to meet someone, or left impulsively. However, when placed against the actual details, this hypothesis began to waver. Elias hadn't taken his wallet, hadn't taken a jacket despite the chilly night, hadn't taken his house keys or any personal items. The disappearance occurred within minutes of stepping onto the porch, behavior inconsistent with someone intending to go far or for long. The discovery of Elias's keychain more than a mile away at the container yard further weakened this hypothesis, as Elias had no reason to walk there at night. More importantly, all family members confirmed Elias had no family conflicts, no psychological issues, no signs of wanting to abandon his current life. The second hypothesis, that Elias was attacked due to personal enmity, emerged when police considered the possibility of someone intentionally approaching Elias in the dark alley. Based on Brian Talbot's statement about two figures, police asked whether someone had been following Elias beforehand or if there was a conflict unknown to the family. However, the Turner family insisted Elias had no enemies. He worked as a printer, had a gentle personality, no debts, no troubles at the shop. His lifestyle didn't suggest he had foes. Additionally, if there had been a direct attack, the scene should have shown signs of struggle, torn fabric, dropped shoes, drag marks, loud noises, but there was nothing. The alley was dark, but not so narrow that sounds couldn't escape. Yet no neighbor heard cries or suspicious noises. The only thing fitting this hypothesis was the figure's appearance, but the vagueness of the statement prevented police from relying on it to confirm. The third hypothesis, abduction, was the one police discussed most cautiously, but also the one that made them pause multiple times for deeper analysis. The lack of struggle signs, sometimes aligned with quick, surprise abductions using weapons or threats to control the victim silently. The container yard where the keychain was found was also noteworthy, accessible by truck, vast and sparsely trafficked, ideal for moving a victim undetected. If the perpetrator used a truck or large pickup cab, pulling Elias into a vehicle in seconds was possible. More importantly, in 1980s Louisiana abductions, perpetrators often exploited remote terrain or industrial lots to change direction or discard victim items. The keychain found in the dirt near the fence could be a trace dropped during movement or intentionally tossed. Police discussed this longer than the first two hypotheses, especially considering the disappearance timing. Elias entered the alley at 9:20, but the family heard nothing unusual, time enough for a silent abduction. Additionally, Brian's statement, two figures, if accurate, could indicate the perpetrator wasn't alone, fitting small organized abduction patterns. However, the hypothesis's weakness lay in no clear witnesses, no license plates, no fresh tire tracks, no physical evidence beyond the keychain, and the item itself could have been dropped earlier unbeknownst to anyone. Still, of the three hypotheses, this was the only one not contradicting any existing clues. Police thus began leaning toward the possibility that Elias was taken somewhere against his will. The older officer, who rarely made emotional comments, wrote at the end of the internal report page, "If Elias did not leave voluntarily, and there is no evidence of on-site attack, then the possibility of him being subdued and transported by motor vehicle exists." That note was clipped into the file, marking the moment police no longer viewed the case as a routine missing person. Although evidence was insufficient to open a criminal file, the combination of physical evidence, vague witness statement, and the extremely quick disappearance timeframe tilted their instincts toward abduction, even if they dared not say it to the Turner family. In the official report, They only wrote victim left the area for unknown reasons. No signs of struggle at scene. Clue, appeared at location distant from disappearance site. Need to expand investigation. But in that small meeting room that day, the prolonged silences after each question said it all. Something had happened in that dark alley that night. Something both police and the Turner family were beginning to sense but couldn't yet name. The gradual shift of the police toward the hypothesis that Elias had been taken against his will forced the search area to expand in the direction that many missing persons cases in Louisiana during this period often pointed to swamps, canals, and the dark bayou branches running parallel to the poor neighborhoods on the city's edge. These stagnant bodies of water were both a natural feature of New Orleans and the biggest obstacle to any search effort, because just a few hundred meters off the paved roads, the terrain turned into a maze of vegetation, black water, and trails that were only visible if you knew every inch of the land. On the morning of the third day, when preliminary reports from the construction sites, vacant lots, and container yards still yielded no new signs, the search team leader decided to deploy a small group to the bayou area, about 2 miles southeast of the Turner home, where an old canal branch once used for transporting goods had been abandoned. This was not a cleared or managed area, but a place where trees grew crowded together, duckweed covered the water's surface, and insects and wading birds emitted sparse sounds as if echoing from another world. The Turner family could not join because the terrain was too difficult, but they understood the meaning of that decision. The police no longer thought Elias was just wandering near home. 3 officers and 2 local volunteers used a small aluminum boat, the kind commonly seen in missing person searches in swampy areas. They pushed the boat down to the water's edge, where thick layers of mud clung and wild grass crept up the bank as if trying to swallow any traces. Each person held a high-powered flashlight, ready to sweep the water's surface and the dense forest edge as the boat glided deeper in. The movement of the boat in the swamp was unlike any other body of water. It rocked, hissed, and shuddered from getting caught on floating roots or large mats of water hyacinth. Even though it was daytime, the air in the bayou grew dim due to the canopy of trees forming a natural roof, with light filtering down only as a thin haze. The search team leader, Officer Wyatt, was familiar with these kinds of sweeps. But he knew well, the presence of flashlights, the boat, and the noise only served to reassure human instinct, while actually finding any sign in this environment was an entirely different matter. They swept their lights along the water's edge, looking for disturbances, footprints, broken branches, drag marks, small objects caught on roots or floating aimlessly. But the bayou was like a living creature, constantly covering up anything that touched it. In just a few hours, water and vegetation could erase traces that might last all day in another environment. One volunteer reached out to push aside a thick layer of duckweed, but there was nothing but black water reflecting the flashlight beam into a cold streak of light. They proceeded deeper along the main canal branch, where wind could escape more easily, but also where floating roots were densest. Officer Wyatt finally decided to bring the boat close to the western bank, where the terrain might be more likely to show footprints if someone unfamiliar wanted to move quickly through the swamp. But even when shining light closed on every tree trunk, every clump of vines, every puddle, they saw no scrap of fabric, no skid mark or anything like a keychain. Once they stopped the boat because they spotted an unusual dark patch floating near the shore. Everyone held their breath, but when they pushed it aside with a paddle, it was just a rotten log section, pushed in from upstream. The deeper they went, the thicker the air became, with the smell of mud and decaying leaves mingling into a vapor that seemed to seep into the skin. Occasional rustling sounds from the reed bushes startled them, making them think it could be a large animal or someone hiding. But when they shone the light in, it was only the eyes of raccoons or hawks perched on branches. They continued moving south for about half a mile more, to a section where the water widened slightly, with a few old wooden posts that once belonged to a small dock from the 1960s. However, there was nothing there either, no sign that Elias had passed through, no sign of belongings or personal items, No sign of stress or struggle, nothing. It was precisely that absolute absence that worried the officers the most. If a crime had occurred near Elias's home, then the person who took him must have had a vehicle and a plan. The bayou was a choice for those wanting to hide traces, but also a place few would risk bringing a victim, unless they were extremely familiar with the terrain. The lack of any traces here led to a more uncomfortable conclusion. The perpetrator, if it was indeed an abduction, was not local to this area and had moved farther away, possibly out of the lower Ninth Ward, or even leaving New Orleans that same night. When the boat turned back toward the starting point, the sun had begun to rise higher, shining through the canopy and revealing strips of steam rising from the swamp surface. With an empty result, the search team came ashore, mud caked on their pants and shoes, like a reminder that they had just traversed hundreds of meters of water with no answers. In the end-of-day report, Officer Wyatt wrote, "No traces of the victim discovered in the bayou area. Terrain conditions can erase signs quickly, but currently no evidence that Elias Turner was ever present here." But the last sentence he added was the noteworthy one. If the victim was transported by motor vehicle, the perpetrator's range of movement may exceed initial estimates. Consider the possibility that Elias is no longer within the nearby radius, and when the report returned to headquarters, it meant one silent but unavoidable truth. The missing persons case had expanded beyond the scope that routine searches could resolve. After 3 days of searching that yielded no tangible traces, and as the possible area where the perpetrator could have taken Elias expanded beyond the lower Ninth Ward, the police were forced to move to the next step in the 1980s investigation process, compiling a social circle suspect list. This was a familiar method for the New Orleans Police Department at a time of limited resources. When there was no clear physical evidence, investigators would screen people with direct or indirect connections to the victim, from friends, co-workers, neighborhood acquaintances, to anyone who had even minor disputes. The purpose was not to accuse, but to find new leads when the scene offered no guidance. The list was compiled in a small room at the back of the district headquarters, where a ceiling fan hummed steadily and case files were stacked so high that 2 extra tables had to be added to prevent them from toppling. Officer Wyatt, who had just returned from the bayou search, sat around a metal table with 2 younger detectives, spreading out before them the relationship map of Elias that the family had provided. From the initial information, Elias did not have a wide social circle. He went to work and came home on time, did not join any groups, had no debts, no criminal record, and no negative behavior recently. This made compiling the suspect list even harder, because no one stood out in his daily relationships. However, in the notes from Elias's younger brother, there was one name that the detectives had circled in red: Caleb Monroe, 27 years old, a neighbor living 2 houses down from the Turners. The family described Caleb as quiet, occasionally hot-tempered, but not causing major issues. However, about 2 months before the disappearance, Elias and Caleb had a minor argument over Elias accidentally parking in the shared yard space between the houses. The argument did not lead to a fight, but the brother remembered Caleb saying something sarcastic like, "One day you'll regret that careless habit." At the time, everyone thought it was just a frustrated remark with no real meaning, but when Elias went missing, every little detail suddenly became a potential clue. The police had no evidence linking Caleb to the case. They didn't even have reason to consider him a real suspect. But based on 1980s investigation experience, especially in a context where missing persons cases were rarely prioritized highly, social disputes were often seen as a reasonable starting point. The young detective Simmons leaned toward quickly ruling out Caleb. No signs of aggression, no criminal record, no connection to the container yard area. But Officer Wyatt tapped his pen on the table 3 times, a habit when his instinct told him something needed closer examination. He said slowly, "We have no traces, no reliable witnesses, no clear direction. In situations like this, the only thing we have is the small factors, and sometimes those are the important ones." The third detective, Harris, reviewed the neighborhood files and noted that Caleb had once worked temporarily for a small trucking company near the container yard. a detail that made the atmosphere in the room heavier. No one could prove Caleb had been in the container yard area the night Elias disappeared, but his familiarity with the yard terrain and surrounding back roads made him stand out more than others on the list. However, all hypotheses were based on instinct, not evidence. When they brought Caleb in for a few questions, he appeared calm, voice steady, not overly defensive, not evasive. He said he was at home at the time Elias disappeared, listening to the radio, drinking beer, then going to bed around 10 o'clock. No one could confirm this statement, but no one could refute it either. Moreover, Caleb was a large-built man, but his speech and demeanor showed no signs of stress or concealment. Officer Wyatt observed him closely, noting every gesture, hands not shaking, eyes not darting, breathing even, no hesitation on tough questions. If he was involved, he was hiding it very well. But if he was innocent, being questioned over a minor argument was certainly unfair. When asked about working for the trucking company, Caleb confirmed it, but said he had quit over a year ago and rarely returned to the container yard area. He also hadn't seen Elias have disputes with anyone else. Before leaving the headquarters, Caleb asked only one question: where could he have gone? "Do you think someone took him?" That question made the young detective look over at Wyatt, waiting for his reaction. But Wyatt just nodded, neither confirming nor denying. When Caleb left the headquarters, the group sat in silence. No one had evidence to remove Caleb from the suspect list, but no one had grounds to keep him as a primary target either. The only thing keeping his name on the list was instinct, something Wyatt trusted more than any investigation form. They continued screening others, Elias's co-workers, a few old friends, distant neighbors, but all showed the same pattern. Elias was a gentle person, rarely causing conflict, no one with a clear motive to harm him. This made Caleb stand out on the social suspect list, not because he was particularly suspicious, but because everyone else was too ordinary. In the end-of-day report, Wyatt wrote, "Preliminary social suspect list includes 7 individuals, with Caleb Monroe most notable due to recent dispute and familiarity with industrial area. No incriminating evidence. Risk level, medium. Note, continue monitoring." The note, "continue monitoring," in every 1980s file, carried a meaning that was both hopeful and desperate. Hopeful, because there was still something to hold on to. Desperate, because it was a sign that the police were still in a severe lack of leads. But at that time, they did not know that the social suspect list, with all its ambiguity, would become the only anchor keeping the disappearance from falling into complete darkness. 2 days after the social suspect list was compiled, the police decided to return for a second interview with Brian Talbot. Not because they believed he was hiding something, but because when all leads hit dead ends, the only statement mentioning the appearance of 2 figures in the alley the night Elias disappeared became a more important reference point than they wanted to admit. Wyatt and Simmons arrived at Brian's house at 8 a.m. The old wooden house sat on the edge of the neighborhood, paint peeling and the porch sagging with age. Brian opened the door, looking dazed, eyes sunken from lack of sleep. He was not surprised to see them, perhaps because he had been expecting this since the first day he reported. When they entered the living room, which had only an armchair and a small table, Simmons opened his notebook and reminded him of the initial statement: 2 figures, unidentifiable, moving in the alley around after 9:20. But when asking about the time again, Brian suddenly hesitated, looking down and saying in a low voice, "It might have been later, around 9:40 or 9:45, I think." Simmons immediately glanced at Wyatt. The change, though small, was significant. Wyatt continued, "Are you sure? In the first statement you said around 9:30. Brian shook his head, his eyes shifting as if arguing with himself. "I work night shifts. Sometimes I get home late. I didn't check the clock. I just remember it was dark and I was in a hurry to get home." This time discrepancy forced the police to readjust the entire timeline of the evening. Elias disappeared. If Brian saw the figures around 9:40 or 9:45, that placed it overlapping with when the Turner family started searching, meaning if those figures were related, They were still in the alley while the family was frantically calling Elias's name. But when Simmons asked again about the movement details, Brian changed again. I think one was standing, one was walking quickly. But maybe both were walking. I'm not sure if they were standing still or not. Wyatt was silent for a few seconds. In the file, Brian had previously stated one person stood as if waiting for someone. Now he wasn't sure that was accurate. This change, for a seasoned detective, was common when a witness was under pressure or memory was disrupted by what they heard afterward. But Simmons, younger and less experienced, was convinced by these changes in the opposite direction. He leaned toward believing Brian, his voice becoming focused. So, you think they were walking, together, or separately? Brian rubbed his forehead, maybe together. But I'm not sure. Simmons underlined a line in his notebook. That line would later become a major cause of misdirection. Wyatt asked about physical characteristics, hoping at least this detail remained consistent. But Brian, instead of shaking his head like the first time, said, "One seemed taller." "I think so, probably taller." Wyatt immediately frowned. "You said you only saw shadows. How could you tell height?" Brian looked up, confused. "The light, their shadows were long, so I thought so. But that didn't match the actual lighting at the alley entrance." Willis, the technical officer who had tested it, reported that light from the street lamp slanting through the trees would never cast shadows clear enough to distinguish height. Simmons, nonetheless, noted the detail, one shadow taller, treating it as a new update. This was the subtle moment marking the deviation. Instead of viewing the changing statement as a sign of weak memory or stress, Simmons saw it as a more accurate confirmation. Wyatt, seeing Brian becoming increasingly confused, narrowed his eyes observing the man. His forehead was sweaty, despite the cool house, his hands constantly clasping together, not signs of a liar trying to hide, but of someone trying to recall, but being tricked by memory the harder they tried. "I think they were walking fast," Brian continued. "Maybe running." They heard shoe sounds. But this made Wyatt interrupt. "Shoe sounds? You previously said you didn't hear anything." Brian jolted as if startled. Right, they didn't hear anything. I'm sorry. These past days I've been thinking about it constantly. I don't know what's real anymore." That admission should have made the police more cautious, but Simmons, due to inexperience or desperation for leads, saw it as a sign Brian was digging deeper into memory, and the new details were more valuable than the initial statement. He softly said, "Initial memories are often inaccurate. Maybe you're remembering more clearly now." Wyatt glanced at Simmons, a warning look, but said nothing. He knew that once a young detective believed the second statement was more accurate, the data would be written that way and affect the entire file. Brian continued explaining why his memory was confused. He had been sleepless since the night of the incident, hearing neighbors gossip, hearing the Turner family ask around, then wondering if he had seen more than he remembered. Police called this memory contamination, but in 1980, the concept was not common in investigation training. Instead of seeing it as a warning sign, Simmons continued encouraging Brian to remember more, inadvertently creating pressure that distorted the memory further. The interview lasted over 45 minutes, and when it ended, Simmons' second transcript was nearly twice as long as the first, but full of inconsistencies. Time changed. Movement details changed. Figure characteristics changed. Wyatt only noted one thing, from start to finish. Brian consistently maintained one detail. He didn't know who they were. When leaving the house, Simmons said confidently that the second statement seemed more reliable because it had more details. Wyatt just stayed silent, closed his notebook, and walked away. In his mind echoed a warning that veteran detectives often shared but was rarely in books. The harder you dig into memory, the more dangerous it becomes. But the police department file recorded differently. Witness statement has been clarified further. Possible two individuals moving quickly in the alley. At the same time, the victim disappeared. And it was this misunderstanding, this blind trust in what was seen as remembering more clearly, that caused the Elias disappearance case to quietly but seriously slide off its initial track. The decision to organize an identification procedure was made at the end of the day following the second interview with Brian Talbot, when the case file began to show vague details that were nonetheless treated as significant leads. Although there were no direct witnesses who saw anyone's face, the police believed that showing Brian a lineup conducted according to the proper procedures of 1980 might help determine whether the shadowy figures in the alley matched anyone on the list of persons of interest. At that time, lineups were conducted entirely manually, no video, no special room, just a small space called the identification room, with gray-painted walls, a dangling fluorescent bulb, and an old one-way mirror whose glass edges had slightly yellowed. They lined up 6 men of relatively similar appearance in the lineup room, including 2 neighbors, a supermarket employee from near Elias's home, a co-worker from the print shop, and 2 undercover officers added to fill out the group. Since Caleb Monroe appeared on the list of persons of interest, he was also required to participate, though it made him uncomfortable. Brian Talbot was brought into the adjacent room, seated facing the one-way mirror, hands on his knees, back straight, but shoulders trembling slightly. Wyatt observed him through the frosted glass, immediately recognizing Brian's tension, unsurprising after days of sleeplessness, community pressure, and the memory confusion from the previous interview. However, instead of viewing this as a factor affecting the reliability of the identification, the young investigator Simmons believed the lineup would help fix Brian's memory, as if seeing real faces would make him more accurately recall the shadowy silhouettes in the alley. An officer read the standard instructions: "You may say I don't recognize anyone if you cannot identify anybody. No one in the lineup is necessarily the person you saw." This was the standard protocol, but in practice at the time, the presence of police and the serious atmosphere often pressured witnesses into feeling they had to pick someone. Brian peered through the mirror, his eyes struggling to focus on each face. But it was here that the difference between the alley silhouettes and real faces became clearer than ever. What he had seen that night was just 2 dark shapes moving. No gender, no skin color, no distinguishing details, while the lineup demanded recognition of specific features. He looked at the first man, then the second, third, fourth, and with each one, the disappointment grew more evident on his face. When he reached Caleb Monroe, Simmons leaned forward slightly, clearly hoping Brian would recognize something. But Brian only uttered 3 quiet words, "Can't tell." After viewing all 6 men, Brian took a long swallow. His hands clasped tightly together. They asked, "Do you recognize anyone?" He shook his head immediately. "No, no one. I can't identify anyone." Simmons lightly bit the end of his pen, frustrated, not because Brian had failed, but because he had expected the lineup to reinforce the second statement and help narrow the suspect list. He did not consider the obvious: the night lighting was too dim, the viewing angle too distant, and Brian had never seen the perpetrator's face, if there even was a perpetrator. Wyatt saw the opposite: the lineup's failure perfectly matched the circumstances of the case, and should have reinforced the conclusion that the witness statement could not be used to identify anyone. But due to the pressure to make progress, the police did not deeply analyze the factors affecting identification reliability. The street lights were too weak, the night was full of damp fog. Brian's position was more than 30 meters from the alley entrance. The observation time was less than 2 seconds, and his memory had been disrupted by stress. These factors, which should have been carefully considered, were completely ignored in the official report. Simmons simply wrote, "Witness unable to identify any individual in lineup. Possible that subjects moved quickly or stood in insufficiently lit position." This note, seemingly harmless, shifted responsibility. Instead of acknowledging the witness could not remember, it suggested the subjects moved too quickly, a mistaken but easily accepted assumption amid mounting investigative pressure. When the lineup ended, Caleb stepped out of the room, visibly irritated, saying that being treated as a suspect and this ridiculous identification session only made him more angry. But his reaction did not change the file. On the contrary, since Brian identified no one, the list of persons of interest did not narrow, leaving the police to implicitly keep Caleb on it, despite no evidence against him. Brian left the room pale-faced. He looked at Wyatt and said his final words, "I'm sorry. I couldn't help." Wyatt placed a hand on his shoulder and gently replied, "No one expects you to remember what can't be remembered." But when the report was sent upstairs, those words did not appear on paper. Instead, the file simply recorded the result. Lineup 1, witness no identification, no analysis, no evaluation of statement quality, no reassessment of reliability. The police did not know, or did not want to know, that this lack of analysis would become the first mistake in a chain of increasingly serious errors, as they placed too much hope in the memory of a witness who, from the start, had been unable to clearly see anything in the darkness of the night. Elias disappeared. The second identification took place just 2 days after the failure of the first lineup, a period too short to expect a vague witness's memory to become more accurate, yet long enough for distorted memory fragments to begin cohering in the way the brain often does under pressure. The decision for a second lineup stemmed from a mix of hope, anxiety, and deadlock. The case showed no progress. Bayou searches yielded nothing. The list of persons of interest could not be narrowed, and Brian's statement, despite contradictions, remained the only bright spot the team clung to. But the danger lay in the fact that this clinging turned the lineup from a verification procedure into a tool to fix the statement in the direction they desired. The second lineup was held in the same small gray-walled room at the parish headquarters, but this time, the lineup consisted of only 4 men, not 6 as before, a minor violation of protocol but fairly common then due to manpower shortages. Caleb Monroe was still included, this time in position number 3. The placement was not random. Simmons, who set up the lineup, wanted Caleb in the center to increase observability for the witness. Wyatt noticed the detail but did not object. He did not want internal conflict to slow progress, and had not yet realized that such a small decision would create a major turning point. Brian was brought into the observation room. He appeared more exhausted than before, eyes ringed with dark circles, hands on the table still trembling slightly. Pressure from the community, the Turner family, and the interviews themselves had pushed him into a psychological state that any psychologist in later decades would call forced recall, when the brain tries to fill gaps with imagination rather than real memory. But Simmons did not know this. The concept was not even formally trained for police at the time. When the lineup began, Simmons read the instructions, this time faster and shorter. He unintentionally, or out of habit, added a sentence that made Wyatt immediately narrow his eyes. "Please look carefully at each person, especially number 3, to see if it matches the silhouette you saw in the alley." Just one sentence, and it completely destroyed the lineup's neutrality. Brian flinched slightly upon hearing number 3 mentioned. The reaction did not escape Wyatt, but Simmons did not stop. Perhaps unaware he had just inadvertently suggested, Brian looked at the first man, no reaction. The second, only a slight frown. But at the third, Caleb, he stared a few seconds longer. Not because he recognized him, but because number 3 had just been highlighted. Brian's eyes wavered, as if trying to fit Caleb's face into the darkness of a memory he had never clearly seen. Wyatt stepped closer and softly reminded, "No one here is necessarily the person you saw," but Simmons immediately interjected, unintentionally pushing the situation into its greatest distortion. "Just say if number 3 looks familiar, even a little." That was the moment everything veered off course. Brian pressed his lips together, pressure from 2 directions. One trying to eliminate bias, the other unintentionally promoting it, pushed him into suggestion-based selection, a phenomenon later proven by science to be highly common in lineups. He took a deep breath, then said, "I think number 3 has a build more similar to the others." Caleb in the lineup room could not hear, but still noticed Simmons' gaze through the glass. When released, Caleb reacted strongly, What the hell is this? On what basis does he say I resemble someone in the dark? I didn't do anything. But the result was recorded in the file. Lineup 2, witness identifies subject number 3 as having build similar to subject in alley. This note, seemingly harmless, became the critical turning point of the entire investigation. Instead of clearly stating that Brian only thought and based it on suggestion, Simmons rewrote it in more certain language. A double error appeared right then: suggestion-based identification error and investigator over-interpretation error. Wyatt read the record and felt uneasy. He knew Brian had not truly identified anyone. He also knew this lineup was unreliable. But he thought of the Turner family, begging for a clear investigative direction. In that moment of hesitation, he did not object as strongly as he should have. And just one line in the file was enough to create an invisible declaration. Caleb Monroe, subject of interest. From that moment, the investigation no longer revolved around where did Elias go, but shifted to the more mistaken question: what did Caleb do to Elias? In the heavy silence of the lineup room, no one knew they had just created a fork that would send the entire case sliding in the wrong direction for years. And it was precisely the second lineup, or more accurately, Simmons' unintentional suggestion and Brian's exhaustion, that became the marker causing the investigation to fall away from its original foundation, opening a chain of errors that no one at the time was alert enough to recognize. After the heavily flawed second identification, the investigative team entered what they called the information standardization phase, but in reality, they inadvertently built a timeline framework based on unverified assumptions. That timeline, which should have been a supporting tool, became a crooked frame that the entire investigation was forced to fit into. Reconstructing the timeline of the night Elias disappeared began with what they considered certain. Elias was last seen around 9:20 when he entered the alley. The family began calling his name around 9:40, and from 10:20 to 10:40, they split up to search the nearby area. But every other detail relied on vague memories, indirect statements, or subjective police inferences. They put it all on a whiteboard in the meeting room. What time Elias might have been where, who might have passed the alley then, who could have approached him. Brian Talbot was placed in the timeline as the primary witness, despite his statement contradicting both timing and number of movements. In the preliminary timeline, police noted 9:30, 9:45, witness Brian Talbot sees two people in alley. They did not mark the instability of this detail, no description of poor lighting, no mention that Brian could not pinpoint the exact time, or that he admitted hearing no sounds and only seeing movement in the dark. The contradictions from the second interview were completely ignored. Simmons simply chose the time frame that best fit the existing assumption that someone, possibly Caleb, approached Elias right in the alley. That timeline segment fit neatly into a less than 20-minute window, yet contained numerous unexplained gaps. For example, if Elias entered the alley at 9:20, what happened in the next 20 minutes? Why did the family hear no noise? If someone approached him, how did they subdue him so quickly without sound? The distance from the alley to the container yard was over a mile. If the perpetrator walked Elias there, why did no one see them? If by vehicle, why did no one hear an engine? None of these questions made it into the report. Instead, they wrote a highly assumptive line that made the entire incident seem plausible. Victim left alley between 9:20 and 9:30 in undetermined direction. This short sentence created a massive loophole into which any later inconsistency, no matter how illogical, could be stuffed to fit. Another error appeared when they placed Caleb in the timeline, despite no evidence he was near the alley that night, because the suggested statement from the second lineup said Caleb had a similar build to the others. Simmons boldly added an arrow. Possible appearance of Caleb between 9:30 and 9:40. No one knew the basis. No one objected. Wyatt stared at the writing for a long time, then closed his eyes, but ultimately did not erase it. Because there was no other evidence, they left the assumption there as an unverified fact. Another inaccuracy came from the Turner family's clock. Elias's mother said, She began worrying around 9:40, but the wall clock in the house, according to Elias's brother, ran 3 minutes fast. This detail was not included in the timeline, leading to errors in search timing calculations. A few minutes discrepancy might seem harmless, but in an investigation, it can completely alter event interpretation. Additionally, they did not consider that the family might have misjudged time due to panic. This made the 9:40–10 o'clock window a blind spot. No one knew exactly what happened, who was nearby, and when Elias moved or was taken. But these issues were not marked in red, not circled with uncertain notes. Instead, Simmons wrote them in black ink as verified information. In another timeline branch, they placed the container yard at around 10:15, not because they had evidence Elias was there then, but because it was the only way to model the discovery of his keychain in that area without contradicting prior assumptions. They treated finding the keychain as proof Elias was present at the yard, rather than considering it might have been placed by someone else. This was a classic analytical mistake, treating peripheral evidence as proof of victim presence. Wyatt recognized this, but did not correct it. Partly because he was not sure he was right, and partly because he did not want to undermine the only thing they had to hold on to. When the timeline was complete, the team looked at the board. On the surface, it looked reasonable, full of arrows, time frames, inferences. But every arrow was based on assumption, every time frame on vague memory, and the entire structure built on the flawed identification from the second lineup. No one said it aloud, but everyone sensed the unease when looking at the final line. Simmons wrote in red, 22 o'clock, Elias Turner highly likely removed from lower 9th Ward area. This was the weightiest statement yet built on the weakest foundation. Nevertheless, it was boxed in the file, becoming the backbone of the investigation. That backbone, crooked, skewed, and full of holes, would lead the entire case in the wrong direction for years, forcing every subsequent fact to be interpreted to fit it rather than examined independently. And that was the moment an initial error was legitimized into truth, becoming a dangerous foundation for the next steps that no one in the meeting room then realized they had just locked themselves onto an irreversible track. Constructing the preliminary timeline convinced the police they had enough framework to re-examine the evidence collected in the early days, even though that evidence had never been properly evaluated. In 1980, the New Orleans Police Department's investigative technology was severely limited. No DNA analysis, no mineralogical soil comparison, no equipment to test fabric fibers to modern standards. Everything relied on the naked eye, subjective experience, and strict but shallow manual procedures. Therefore, when they reopened the evidence bags containing items found near the Turner home, and later at the container yard, their interpretation was already guided by the flawed timeline, causing physically neutral details to be read in ways that reinforced the hypothesis they wanted to believe. The first piece of evidence was Elias's shoes, found in the backyard corner where the family had searched the first night. The shoes were placed neatly, with no signs of being yanked off or dropped in a struggle. The soles had ordinary mud, not the distinctive swamp mud, a detail that should have raised questions, because if Elias was dragged away from the residential area, his shoes should show movement traces rather than lying neatly as if set down. But because the timeline assumed Elias left the alley without struggle, police viewed the shoes as evidence he removed or left them before departing, an forced inference, but fitting their locked-in assumption. Elias's thin jacket was found the second day, under a bush near an ongoing construction site. The jacket was not torn, not heavily muddied, only bearing a few patches of fine dirt and dry leaves, the kind wind could easily blow around. Wyatt had a feeling the jacket was placed by someone, not dropped in a scuffle, but that feeling did not become an official note. In the file, the jacket was marked, possibly dropped during victim departure from scene. No one asked why the jacket was so far away if Elias was just walking around the house as usual. No one treated the unusually clean jacket as suspicious. The most important yet most downplayed evidence was Elias's thin leather wallet. The wallet was found near the alley entrance, not in the alley, but at the road edge, where streetlight illuminated enough for someone to notice if looking. Inside were all papers, cash, Idaho card, and family photos intact. This led police to conclude the wallet was not something a perpetrator tried to take, but simply a personal item Elias carried and dropped. But the inconsistency was that Elias almost never carried his wallet when stepping onto the porch in the evening. The family confirmed this. Even so, police noted the wallet as evidence. Victim left area in unclear state. Wyatt stared at the wallet a long time, wondering why someone who did not carry a wallet would drop it in such a visibly obvious way. As if someone deliberately placed it there to create the impression Elias walked away voluntarily, but there were no tools to test that hypothesis. The department's 1980 forensic technology stopped at photographing scenes, handwritten notes, and occasionally using a small magnifying glass for scratches, all dependent on subjectivity. No technology to determine last touch, no sophisticated fingerprint analysis, no mineral soil comparison to identify dirt origin on jacket or shoes. Investigators could only rely on crude reasoning. If items undamaged, no struggle. If contents intact, no robbery. If items in visible position, victim dropped them himself. All these conventions were era-specific yet turned into investigative truth. They continued examining mud on shoe soles and jacket, but without a soil analysis lab, police simply recorded mud. Not unusual. A meaningless conclusion used to reinforce the timeline. Fabric fibers on the jacket hem were also found, but no one compared them to any samples due to lack of specialized tools. The fibers were described in the file with 4 words, source unknown. No one asked why. If source unknown, it was not treated as an important clue, instead of immediately dismissed. All the evidence, shoes, jacket, wallet, and dirt patches on the jacket, were recorded in ways that made them fit the hypothesis. Elias voluntarily left the area, and that artificial fit caused them to miss the possibility that the items were not dropped by Elias, but placed by someone else to stage the scene. In the end-of-day report, Simmons wrote with dangerous confidence, evidence shows no signs of struggle or forced movement. Possibility victim, left area of own volition, remains under consideration. Wyatt stared at that sentence a long time before signing approval, feeling something slipping out of control. But he had no physical evidence to refute it. All they had were scattered items, rendered silent by limited technology. And that silence inadvertently pushed the investigation even further from the true nature of the disappearance. While the evidence collection team was still fumbling with Elias's scattered belongings and trying to interpret them in a way that fit the preliminary timeline they believed was correct, many other important clues were regrettably overlooked. Partly due to bias, partly due to limited capabilities, but mostly because they did not truly treat this disappearance as a serious criminal case. On the very night Elias vanished, a neighbor living just 2 houses away from the Turner home called the non-emergency line of the police department directly to report hearing a strange noise, like the sound of a metal door slamming hard or a heavy object being thrown into a truck bed, around 9:25 or 9:30 p.m. The person clearly heard a clang, followed by the loud roar of an engine starting, along with the distinctive smell of diesel exhaust. But when recording the information, the duty officer simply wrote, "Unidentified sound, unclear relevance." No one followed up with that witness, no one asked any additional questions, and no one added this noise to the overall clue board. The sound disappeared into the gaps of the file as if it had never existed, whereas if handled properly, it could have become a very significant indicator that Elias had been taken away by a motor vehicle. Overlooking the noise was already a major error, but there was another even more serious clue that the police also missed, the license plate of the brown panel van that a delivery driver saw turning into the alley behind the Turner home about 10 minutes before Elias disappeared. The driver clearly told the store owner where he was making a delivery that the van didn't look like it belonged to anyone around here because it was a modified 1978 Ford Econoline with a custom rear cargo box and a long streak of peeling paint running from the cab to the rear wheel. He vaguely remembered the first three characters of the plate, P6B or P68. The store owner passed that information on to the patrol officers when they stopped by to ask if anyone had seen Elias, but instead of carefully noting it down, the officer just nodded and treated it as a minor detail. As a result, the plate was never entered into the vehicle tracing system, never faxed internally to other patrol units, never cross-checked against lists of suspicious vehicles in the area, and never included in the summary report. Even by late 1980, when some younger investigators wanted to go back and review information about the van, they discovered that data had never been officially recorded. A specific opportunity to identify a vehicle potentially directly involved in the disappearance was lost simply because of the subjective mindset that there was no evidence of a crime yet, so no need to expand the investigation. Furthermore, the police failed to create a crime perimeter map, a critically important step in mysterious disappearances, even though by 1980, many police departments across the United States were already using it. The crime perimeter is not just the location where the victim vanished, but also includes likely routes the perpetrator could have taken, escape paths, obscured areas, spots with potential witnesses, zones with poor lighting, and places where evidence might be discarded. However, the New Orleans investigation team at the time, short on manpower, short on technology, and guided by the assumption that the victim left voluntarily, did not create this map. This led to them not accurately marking the spot where the jacket was found, not cross-referencing the shoe's location with wind direction, not analyzing the relationship between the wallet's position and vehicle escape routes, and not considering connections between the evidence discovery points. All those locations should have been pinned on a map to see if they formed a logical movement path, a basic investigative method that even small units in other towns during the same period were using. The failure to create a map meant the entire investigation team lost a broader view of the case, causing every detail to be seen in isolation, lacking context, lacking systematic connections, and resulting in a distorted picture. A clear example of this mistake was the distance between the jacket's location and the wallet's location. If properly marked, they would have realized those 2 points could not have resulted from a normal pedestrian, but were more consistent with vehicular movement, followed by throwing or placing items, but no one viewed them that way. Additionally, a young witness working the night shift at a gas station near the area also reported that around 9:40 p.m., a strange man wearing a dark jacket and appearing panicked came in to ask for change to use the public phone booth, but the man never actually made a call. Strangely, he stepped out, looked around as if afraid of being followed, then climbed into a light brown panel van parked in the corner of the lot. This witness provided those details to the investigation unit, but since no one connected that van to the overlooked license plate, the police treated it as an unrelated event. All those scattered clues, the metal noise, the vague license plate, the gas station witness, signs of vehicular movement, should have been linked together. But the lack of focus, lack of method, and lack of recognition that this disappearance could be a major crime caused the police to miss them. While they still viewed Elias as just an adult who voluntarily left, the signs of an organized abduction were buried in superficial reports. If those clues had been properly collected and analyzed, the perpetrator might have been identified much earlier, or at least the process of building a false narrative would have been stopped from the start. But as each important sign was overlooked one by one, the gaps in the file grew larger, and those very gaps created the perfect conditions for the next mistake. Under pressure to provide an answer, and in a context lacking concrete evidence, the police chose what seemed like the simplest and most reasonable path at the time, a decision that would haunt the Elias Turner disappearance file for decades to come. They proceeded to arrest Caleb Monroe. It all started with them being led too deeply by Brian Talbot's mistaken identification, which had changed multiple times, culminating in the second lineup, where Brian, under invisible pressure from investigator Simmons, pointed at Caleb and said, "I think that's him." In an investigation riddled with shortcomings, that "I think it's him" became the foundation for the police to shift from searching to accusing. There was no physical evidence, no independent witnesses, no scene traces linked to Caleb, no suspicious vehicle, no sign that Elias had ever conflicted with Caleb, and not even a body, but with just one unreliable identification, the investigation team decided they had a suspect. In their mindset, every case needed someone to pursue, and Caleb, with his minor personal issues, a past of petty arguments with Elias, and his quiet demeanor became the perfect target for prejudice. The absence of a body, which should have made them more cautious, was instead used as a reason to expedite the arrest. No body is fine. Many murder cases still get prosecuted. When Simmons said that in the meeting room, some younger investigators looked hesitant, but no one had a strong enough voice to stop it. They didn't use a perimeter map, didn't analyze evidence, didn't trace the license plate, didn't check peripheral evidence, but they acted very quickly on a vague identification. The day Caleb was arrested was just 3 weeks after the night Elias disappeared. It was a hot, humid afternoon in June in New Orleans, when high temperatures and thick humidity made the air in the uptown neighborhood feel heavy like an impending storm. Police arrived at Caleb's house at 4:15 p.m., knocked 3 times, then broke down the door when he hesitated to respond due to shock. They pulled Caleb to the floor, handcuffed him while haphazardly reading his Miranda rights amid the chaotic noise of neighbors rushing over to watch. Caleb did not resist, did not shout, and only repeated one sentence, "I don't know where Elias went. I didn't do anything." But to Simmons, that only reinforced his belief that he had caught the right person, because he believed guilty people always say they're innocent. Notably, in the arrest report, the police wrote, "Primary evidence, witness identified suspect via lineup." That was the only line in the evidence supporting arrest section. No shoes from Caleb matching the mud. No blood, no fingerprints at the evidence locations. No witnesses seeing Caleb near the scene. No location data. No conflicting statements. No motive, nothing except a finger point. But all that was more than enough for the police apparatus at the time, which was under community pressure to produce results. And so, with just one identification and a vague suspicion, the case entered dangerous territory. No body prosecution, prosecuting without a body. This is an extremely rare type of case, only applied when prosecutors are extremely confident or when investigators are overly subjective and want to prove they're not wrong. In this case, it was the latter. The night after arresting Caleb, in a brief investigation team meeting, Simmons declared, "No body doesn't mean no crime. Turner hasn't returned after 3 weeks. No signs of life, so he's certainly dead. And if he's dead, the last person identified near the alley is Caleb." A reasoning both illogical and evidence-free, but the remaining investigators nodded in agreement because they were tired of finding no new leads. The Elias Turner file, which should have been treated as a complex disappearance with high criminal indicators, was turned into a murder without a body just to satisfy the need for a perpetrator. The Orleans Parish prosecutor, receiving the file, signed the indictment despite knowing the lack of evidence, partly due to public pressure and partly because they trusted the police had dug enough. This was the moment marking the historic mistake of the Louisiana justice system in the 1980s. A mistake that later investigative agencies would describe as investigative bias becoming legalized truth. Caleb was detained at Orleans Parish Prison, housed with actual violent suspects, while he had no prior convictions, no serious violation history, and no record of violence. The first interrogation took place in a small, dark and stifling room, where Simmons repeatedly used psychological pressure tactics. "Elias is dead. We know you did it. Confess so the court goes easy." Caleb just shook his head, saying that on the night Elias disappeared, he was at home fixing an old radio. But they didn't believe him. No one verified his statement. No one checked the radio. No one checked if neighbors heard him staying home. No one took any verification steps. When the arrest was announced in local newspapers, the community was divided. Half believed the police had done right, the other half felt something was off. But voices of doubt were quickly drowned out by the prosecutor's strong statements. "We have a witness identification. We believe the victim is dead, and the prime suspect is Caleb Monroe." No one knew that the file they used as a foundation was built on a mistaken identification, overlooked clues, and subjective assumptions. No one knew that Elias had never been found, and no one expected that the decision to arrest Caleb that day would become the key factor, sending the Elias Turner case into a dead end for nearly 3 decades. The 1981 trial took place in an atmosphere where the outcome seemed predetermined, because ever since Caleb Monroe was arrested based entirely on Brian Talbot's mistaken identification, the Orleans Parish Prosecutor's Office was determined to turn Elias Turner's disappearance into a murder case. Regardless of the fact that there was no body, no forensics, no incriminating physical evidence, and no physical clues linking Caleb to the night Elias vanished. From the opening day at the district court on Royal Street, Prosecutor Richard Mayhew entered the courtroom with confident demeanor, stood before the jury, and began with firm statements: "The victim is dead, and that death was no accident. The person responsible is Caleb Monroe." What made those words frightening was that they were not based on any objective evidence. The entire prosecution argument was built on 2 pillars: the subjective inference that an adult cannot voluntarily disappear for so long without contact, and Brian's identification, a witness whose memory had been distorted through multiple interrogations, dim alley lighting, long distance, and invisible pressure from investigator Simmons. The prosecution had no blood, no soil samples, no fabric fibers, no fingerprints, no suspicious vehicle linked to Caleb. They also could not establish a clear motive, only citing a minor argument between Caleb and Elias a few months earlier, a matter that both had resolved, but which the prosecution expanded, exaggerated, and portrayed as simmering hatred. Without forensics to support the argument, Mayhew relied entirely on jury psychology, that prolonged disappearance equals death. Death equals crime. Crime must have a perpetrator, and that perpetrator, according to him, was the one identified by the sole witness. Throughout the cross-examination, Brian Talbot sat on the witness stand, hands trembling under the jury's piercing stares, and when the prosecutor asked, "Are you sure the person you saw that night was Caleb Monroe?" Brian swallowed, eyes averted, then answered, I believe so." From that one uncertain sentence, the prosecution spun it into an affirmation. They repeatedly emphasized that Brian had positively identified in the second lineup, completely distorted information by omitting the fact that investigator Simmons had misleadingly suggested the position number. Caleb's defense attorney at the time, Arthur DeVoe, was not a lawyer experienced in complex criminal cases. DeVoe lacked funds to hire experts, lacked ability to gather additional clues, and especially could not counter a prosecutor seen as unbeatable in that decade. He tried to argue that no body meant no proof the victim was dead, but the prosecution strongly rebutted that bodies aren't always found, then cited a series of successful no-body prosecutions in other states, though fundamentally different. They distracted the jury with fear. If we release a murderer, who will be the next victim? The jury, consisting of 12 ordinary New Orleans residents, lacked deep knowledge of forensics or witness identification errors, and were not informed about the clues police had overlooked: the metal noise in the alley, the brown van's license plate, the strange man at the gas station, the misplaced evidence items. Those details were never introduced in court. They were excluded because the prosecution deemed them irrelevant. The court also did not allow defense attorney DeVoe to question Simmons about suggestive identification in the lineup, because the lineup record was considered completed procedure. Caleb sat there, in a white shirt too loose on his gaunt frame, after more than half a year in detention, continuously shaking his head in despair. When he stood to testify on his own behalf, his voice faltered. "That night I was at home. I didn't see Elias. I don't know what happened to him." But against a prosecutor, skilled at storytelling, a hesitant witness who appeared multiple times before the jury, and a file constructed toward conviction. Caleb's words were like an echo in a room no one wanted to hear. When closing arguments ended, the jury took less than 4 hours to decide. Caleb was declared guilty. Despite no body, no physical evidence, no forensics, no motive, no confession, no tangible connection between him and the night Elias disappeared, the court sentenced him to life imprisonment without parole. That meant Caleb would spend the rest of his life behind bars, based solely on one historically mistaken identification. As Caleb was escorted out of the courtroom, he whispered just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "The truth will come back one day," but at that time, no one believed him. And the 1981 verdict became the darkest in Louisiana's missing persons investigation history. A man convicted of murder without a victim, without a body, and without evidence. Only mistakes, prejudice, and guided fear. After Caleb Monroe was sentenced to life without parole, the Elias Turner case, which had been murky from the start, suddenly stalled as if everything the justice system needed was complete. Prosecutor Richard Mayhew declared to the press that justice has been served, and though the body was never found, he argued that prolonged absence without signs of life was strong enough evidence to confirm Elias was dead. Those words, printed in local newspapers, convinced the community that the matter was closed, and they shifted attention to other stories. But for the New Orleans Police Department's files, it meant something more troubling. The case was literally closed. The mud-stained evidence items, the misplaced jacket, the wallet on the roadside, statements about the metal noise, the overlooked license plate, and the strange man at the gas station, all were stuffed into a box, labeled closed, no further leads. In March 1981, the Elias Turner file was officially moved to the cold storage of the evidence room, where hundreds of unsolved disappearances gathered dust. No investigator was assigned to continue monitoring, no resources, no direction from the prosecutor, no community pressure. The case faded into a name in the long list of unanswered ones in the city. In the early years after the trial, Elias's family continued asking police if there was any new information. The first time they got, nothing additional. The second, if there is, we'll contact you. And by the third year, when Elias's father called, the duty officer said bluntly, "You should learn to accept it." To the system, Elias was dead. Caleb was the perpetrator, and it was over. But in reality, no further evidence was found to reinforce that conclusion. No one discovered new signs at the construction site where the jacket was found. No one traced back to mechanics around the city for the brown Ford Econoline. No one re-examined the fabric fibers on the jacket or the strange mud on the shoes. No one considered that the evidence might have been staged. All investigative paths were locked by the conclusion, the perpetrator has been caught. The case is done. The 1980s passed with very little attention to the file. In the city, crime rose rapidly. Police were overloaded, budgets limited, and new cases kept emerging. In that context, Elias Turner's disappearance was seen as a solved case despite no body, a type internally called paper closure. In 1987, when swamps north of the city were cleared for a new highway, a worker reported finding a piece of fabric, possibly from a missing person, but the site supervisor only sent a perfunctory notice, and no one came to collect it. That report was clipped into the file, without further notes. Even later, when crime researchers began talking more about witness identification errors and lineup mistakes, no one in New Orleans revisited the Elias Turner case. It was simply a file in a box, gathering dust, silent. Meanwhile, Caleb Monroe lived in Angola prison, one of the strictest in America, enduring the isolation of someone convicted of murder without a body. He wrote multiple letters to the court, lawyers, and innocence organizations, but most went unanswered or were denied for no new evidence. From the system's perspective, the case was closed. No corpse, no new scene, no new confession, and no community pressure. Legally, it was labeled a cold case in the coldest sense, not because clues were unsolvable, but because the system believed it was solved. Elias Turner, a man who once sat on his porch on a May evening in 1980, vanished from real life, and from the city's official memory. No one knew where he went. No one knew if he was alive or dead. No one knew where the brown van came from. No one knew who the strange man at the gas station was. No one knew what the metal noise in the night meant. All that remained were a few thin report pages, locked in a dark filing cabinet. And this case, with mistakes accumulating from the very first moments, officially became one of Louisiana's longest-running cold cases, waiting many years for a chance to be illuminated again by a discovery that would shock the entire city. In the summer of 1998, when the Elias Turner case had faded into obscurity for nearly 2 decades, and Caleb Monroe was still serving a life sentence at Angola, an unexpected event in Terrebonne Parish dragged the entire file back into the light, shattering the silence that the Louisiana justice system had assumed would last forever. It was an August morning when a construction crew working on the expansion of LA 24 began excavating the ground to lay foundations for a new drainage culvert. The area had been wilderness interspersed with scrub forest before 1980, later repeatedly cleared, abandoned and reused, so no one imagined that anything noteworthy lay beneath the deep soil layers besides rotten tree stumps or old trash. But when the excavator bucket reached a depth of about 1.5 meters, the operator heard a small crack, not like the sound of roots, but sharper and more brittle. He stopped the machine, climbed down to check, and immediately recognized white bone fragments mixed in with the thick brown mud, covered in dust. At first they thought it was animal bones, but when one worker bent down to pick up a longer piece, the group fell silent. It was a human femur fragment, unmistakable in size and shape. The Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Office was called immediately. Within an hour, the area was cordoned off with yellow tape, and the investigation team along with forensic examiners were dispatched to the scene. Because the skeleton was buried deep under multiple soil layers, with no signs of recent disturbance, the forensic specialists quickly confirmed that the remains had been interred for many years, even decades. What particularly drew their attention was the geographic location. The site was nearly 2 hours' drive southwest of New Orleans, completely outside the 1980 search perimeter. After meticulously collecting all the remains, following procedures that included photographing, creating an on-site preliminary map, and sorting bone groups into specialized bags, they discovered an important detail: the upper jaw was relatively intact, including a front tooth that had been restored with silver amalgam filling, a common technique in the 1970s. That tooth became the key clue in identifying the victim. All the remains were transferred to the examination lab in Baton Rouge for analysis. In the days that followed, the forensic team compared dental samples with archived records from missing persons cases of the same era. And in the dusty New Orleans files, a thin folder containing a few dental X-ray photos of a person missing since 1980 was pulled from a cabinet: Elias Turner. When the medical examiner compared the contours of the silver-filled tooth with the old X-rays, the match was nearly perfect. There was no doubt the remains found in Terrebonne Parish were those of Elias Turner, the man the system had declared dead without a body, and whose disappearance had led to another man being imprisoned for 17 years. As soon as the identification was confirmed, notifications were sent to the New Orleans Police Department and the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office. For the first time in 18 years, the Elias Turner file was removed from long-term storage and opened on an investigation desk under cold white lights. But this reopening was not merely reviewing an old case. It posed a far heavier question: if Elias had truly been murdered and buried nearly 100 miles from New Orleans, how could Caleb Monroe, a man with no car, no friends in that area, and no evidence of leaving the city on the night Elias vanished, have transported the body there? The faded records from 1980 began to look unstable when viewed against this new reality. A more terrifying truth gradually emerged: the case that had been closed on paper had never actually been solved, and the arrest of Caleb Monroe may have been a tragic mistake. Facing the investigators were a set of remains, an 18-year timeline, an entirely new geographic scope, and a series of unanswered questions. But one thing was certain: the discovery of Elias Turner's remains forced the system to tear away the dust covering the old file and confront all the errors of 1980. And from that moment, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the Elias Turner case was officially reopened. When the forensic report confirmed that the remains found in Terrebonne Parish were indeed Elias Turner, the New Orleans Police Department was forced to confront a possibility never seriously considered before. The body had been buried in a location far too distant from the assumed scope of the 1980 investigation. To compensate for past oversights, they took a step never done in the 1980s. Criminal geographic profiling based on spatial data, travel routes, transportation infrastructure, and the geographic characteristics of the recovery site. The analysis began with the most critical question: how could someone like Elias, with no family vehicle, no habit of traveling far at night, and no reason to leave home more than 30 miles, end up buried in a remote part of Terrebonne Parish? The answer could not be he went there himself, making the hypothesis of forced abduction clearer than ever. When the investigation team spread out a map of Louisiana and measured the straight-line distance from Elias's home on Freerit Street to the burial site, the figure was 32 miles, nearly 52 kilometers. That was a distance impossible to walk, impossible to hitchhike, impossible to drift to accidentally. It was a distance feasible only with a motor vehicle. It required at least one strong individual with a truck or van familiar with the rural road network around Houma and nearby areas. This effectively ruled out Caleb Monroe almost immediately. Caleb lived in the uptown area, worked at a small garage, had never held a commercial driver's license, and had not left the city beyond a few miles radius for years. Even more telling, on the night Elias disappeared, Caleb had no vehicle. Neighbors even confirmed that the only car Caleb occasionally shared with family had a broken transmission for weeks prior to the disappearance. There was no logical route or timeline suggesting Caleb could abduct an adult man and transport him out of the city over 32 miles between 9:20 p.m. and dawn the next day, without leaving any trace. The initial criminal geographic profiling conclusion was starkly clear. The perpetrator needed transportation, knowledge of the roads, and a reason to take Elias specifically to Terrebonne, not a place an urban resident would stumble upon by chance. When geographic profiling experts were brought in, they added further detail. The most likely route from New Orleans to the burial site was the old US 90, a stretch with very few traffic cameras, passing through sparsely populated rural areas where a truck could stop unnoticed. It was a route used by fishermen, industrial truck drivers, and night shift workers. A 22-year-old like Caleb at the time had no reason to travel this road, let alone leave the city more than 30 miles at night, unless he was a long-haul driver, a cross-country trader, or a criminal accustomed to highway travel. But Caleb fit none of those profiles. Painfully, when this reasoning was presented, several veteran investigators quickly admitted that this should have been considered back in 1980. But at that time, the New Orleans police completely lacked both the capability and the tools to conduct proper geographic profiling. In the early 1980s, most investigations revolved around local areas, guided by the mindset, if a victim disappears, search within a few blocks. The idea that a victim could be taken dozens of miles away was almost never entertained, except in kidnappings by major crime syndicates. In reality, the 1980 file contained no search radius maps, no estimates of perpetrator travel time, no marked evidence recovery points to reconstruct movement chains. The team had no spatial analysts and no inter-parish investigation budget. Therefore, when Elias's body appeared in Terrebonne Parish, all prior assumptions immediately became absurd. However, while geographic profiling completely exonerated Caleb, it provided no clues about who actually took Elias there. This created a heartbreaking paradox. They knew an innocent man was in prison, but they had no idea who the real perpetrator was. The New Orleans Police Department wanted to reopen the investigation in a new direction, but was immediately constrained by three factors: lack of funding, lack of specialized personnel, and lack of authority to investigate deeply in Terrebonne Parish without formal coordination. Moreover, the late 1990s context was one in which New Orleans was drowning in a crime wave, stretching police resources thin. Thus, even though the analysis clearly showed Caleb could not be the perpetrator, the case was not systematically reinvestigated. Everything stopped at an internal report stating distance between victim's home and recovery site does not align with suspect's mobility. Further investigation recommended. But the recommendation was never acted upon. The Elias Turner file once again fell into a strange limbo. A body had been found, but no perpetrator identified. Evidence exonerating Caleb existed, but no one to replace him. Motivation to reopen the investigation was present, but no capacity to execute it. As a result, the case returned to the silence of years past, but this time more dangerous, because now the system knew it had been wrong, yet was unable or unwilling to correct it. And Elias Turner remained a victim denied justice, at least as of 1998. After the 1998 geographic profiling conclusion demonstrated that Caleb Monroe could not, physically or logically, have been the perpetrator who transported Elias Turner to a burial site more than 30 miles from home. The case file once again gradually sank into silence. That silence persisted stubbornly for a full decade, becoming the coldest void in the entire timeline of the case. A period when no one actively followed up, no one reviewed, no one asked questions, and no one felt responsible for reopening a file that had caused a grave miscarriage of justice in the Louisiana system. In September 1998, shortly after the shock of the remains discovery, the New Orleans Police Department did hold a brief meeting to consider the possibility of reinvestigation. But the meeting lasted less than 40 minutes and ended with the words, "Lack of manpower, lack of budget, await new information." And from that moment, the Elias Turner file, which had been pulled out after nearly 20 years frozen, was placed back into cold storage, this time with a new red stamp, pending, no assigned investigator. That note was little different from a second death sentence on the truth itself. In the late 1990s, New Orleans faced severe crime challenges, particularly drive-by shootings, drug-related crime, and rising street gangs. When police budgets were spread thin across hot cases, cold cases without media value were immediately pushed to the lowest priority. And among them, the Elias Turner case ranked last on the internal list. Police quietly called the forgotten files, cases no one wanted to revisit because they were tied to failures from the previous decade. Between 1999 and 2002, Elias's family sent letters twice, requesting updates, but the responses were identical: "We will contact you when new information becomes available." The problem was that no one was looking for new information. No investigator was assigned. No internal progress reports were filed. No meetings analyzed the flaws of the old trial. No efforts coordinated between New Orleans and Terrebonne to re-examine the US 90 route. No actions to recheck the overlooked brown truck lead. Everything was complete silence, as if the system wanted to bury the case a second time, this time in oblivion rather than mere error. The years 2003, 2004 marked a period when the federal criminal justice community began broadly discussing wrongful convictions, eyewitness identification flaws, and new awareness of modern forensics. But those movements seemed to circle around Louisiana without ever touching the old files at the New Orleans Police Department. No one reopened the rudimentary 1980 forensic report. No one retested soil samples, now fully analyzable with new technology. No one compared fabric fibers stuck to Elias's clothing with materials from that era. No one pursued the overlooked license plates. No one asked what the metallic noise in the alley on the night Elias disappeared might mean. Then in 2005, Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, causing massive loss to the city and its administrative systems. Numerous files were water damaged, evidence lockers flooded, storage rooms ruined. In the chaotic days after the storm, some cold cases were transferred to temporary storage in Baton Rouge, including the Elias Turner file. This inadvertently pushed the case deeper into oblivion. It was not only shelved, but removed from the reach of anyone who once knew it. From 2006 to 2007, police reforms in Louisiana focused on reducing gun crime, improving rapid response, and clearing backlogs of new cases. No cold case program was established. No dedicated investigation unit, no resources to dig into old mistakes. Those 10 years passed in chilling quiet. While an innocent man remained behind bars, while Elias's remains sat in forensic storage, awaiting cause of death clarification. While a wealth of new data could have opened entirely different investigative paths, no one did anything. This was not unintentional stagnation, but systemic silence, where the old mistakes were so large that people hesitated to unearth them. If that file were reopened, it would expose all the shortcomings of the 1980 investigation, from procedural flaws in identification lineups to the decision to convict Caleb Monroe based solely on a single unverified witness statement. But for the next 10 years, that did not happen. The community gradually forgot the name Elias Turner. Old articles were no longer mentioned, there were no memorials, no advocacy groups or organizations continued pursuing the truth. Elias became just another name on the long list of missing persons, overshadowed by newer, louder cases that more easily captured attention. It was not until 2008, after nearly a decade of silence that had plunged old Louisiana cases deep into darkness, that a major shift in the criminal justice system began, and that very shift inadvertently placed the Elias Turner file back in the spotlight. The story began with Ava Lambert, the new district attorney of Orleans Parish, who took office amid growing public pressure for transparency, accountability, and correction of long-standing judicial errors from previous generations. Lambert was known as tough but pragmatic, forward-thinking, and particularly concerned with wrongful convictions, not out of softness, but because she believed a system is only strong when it is willing to fix its mistakes. Shortly after taking over the prosecutor's office, Lambert ordered a review of all cases with high risk of error, including those lacking forensics, heavily reliant on eyewitness testimony, or missing a body. And that review list led her to a case forgotten for nearly 30 years, the disappearance and death of Elias Turner, along with the life sentence of Caleb Monroe. When the file was brought to her desk, Lambert spent nearly 2 hours just reading the beginning and immediately recognized the anomaly, a nobody murder case closed in 1981. Yet remains discovered in 1998. So why had the conviction not been reviewed? Why was there no post-conviction evaluation documentation? Why were there no forensic reports related to the remains? And most importantly, why did the file note no assigned investigator? Lambert immediately called the archives chief and demanded every document related to the case be pulled from storage. As she examined each item, each note, each report in detail, a series of contradictions became glaringly obvious. First contradiction, the 32-mile distance from Elias's home to the burial site, completely incompatible with the case against Caleb, who had no vehicle, no motive, no ability to move Elias out of the city. Second contradiction, the eyewitness identification by Brian Talbot, which changed repeatedly, was influenced by improper lineup procedures and lacked any independent corroboration. Third contradiction, zero forensics, no blood samples, no fingerprints, no signs of struggle, no evidence Elias was ever in Caleb's car or near Caleb on the night he vanished. Fourth contradiction, misplaced evidence, Elias's jacket, shoes and wallet, found at 3 different locations, yet 1980 police concluded it was voluntary departure. Fifth, and greatest contradiction, the body buried deep in the woods of Terrebonne Parish, a place with no connection to the lives or movements of either Elias or Caleb. Reaching this point, Lambert leaned back in her chair and sighed. She knew she was facing a serious miscarriage, or worse, a grave wrongful conviction shrouded by time and indifference. The question was no longer should we review it, but why has no one reviewed it until now? That realization led her to make an unprecedented decision in Orleans Parish, establish the Louisiana Cold Case Unit, a dedicated team to reinvestigate old cases, operating independently from regular investigations for the first time. The unit consisted of 3 veteran former FBI agents, 1 modern forensic analyst, and 2 lawyers specializing in post-conviction investigation. Lambert personally wrote the mission statement: review all old files showing signs of oversight, error, or contradiction. Find new evidence. Exonerate if necessary. When the unit was formed, they needed an initial case study, a file with high error risk but still potential for leads. The Elias Turner case stood out above all. Remains discovered but cause of death undetermined. Convicted individual incompatible with geographic profiling. Scant physical evidence. Sole unreliable witness and old file notes that Lambert described as dangerous. No body, no forensic. Identification only. The Louisiana Cold Case Unit immediately selected the Elias Turner case as priority number 1. On March 14, 2008, in a small meeting room at the prosecutor's office, the file was opened before the 6 new team members. Lead investigator Reed Holman, a former FBI agent, flipped through the pages and within 10 minutes declared, "This is a disaster of a case. No forensics, no logic, no connection." This conviction wouldn't hold up under 2008 investigation standards. The youngest forensic analyst on the team, Lena Moret, added, "The 1980 evidence, still preserved, can be reanalyzed with new technology. There's no reason not to." Lambert listened to everything, took quick notes, then said the words that would later become a landmark in Louisiana justice. "If we don't reopen this case, it means we accept letting injustice stand, and I didn't come here to protect injustice." After more than 10 years buried in oblivion, the Elias Turner file was officially relabeled, reopened, full review required. From that moment, after nearly 3 decades, the truth finally had a chance to be re-examined, and Louisiana prepared to face a truth it had evaded for far too long. When the Louisiana Cold Case team officially took over the Elias Turner file, the first step they decided to take was not reviewing the witness statements, nor examining the physical evidence, but reconstructing the entire 1980 crime scene using modern 3D simulation technology, a method that did not exist at the time of Elias's disappearance. Lead investigator Reed Holman believed that every flaw in the original investigation stemmed from Brian Talbot's sole identification, and he wanted to re-examine the most critical issue: whether Brian could actually have seen any faces under the lighting conditions, and from the position he was standing in 1980. The technical team accurately recreated the structure of the alley behind Turner's house, based on city maps, old photographs, family statements, and police records. They input data about the alley's dimensions, the height of nearby buildings, the position of the metal trash can, the streetlight pole, the direction of the lighting, and even the wattage of the old yellow sodium bulbs common in New Orleans at the time. The lighting data was recreated based on the 1979 technical catalog from the Louisiana streetlight manufacturer, a detail that made the simulation nearly perfectly accurate. When the lighting simulation was activated in the 3D space, everyone immediately recognized the problem. The only light shining into the alley was more than 28 feet away from where Brian said he was standing, and it was partially blocked by a large branch from an old oak tree. The ground was only dimly lit, enough to distinguish movement or basic shapes, but completely insufficient to clearly see a face. The simulation team continued by inputting the weather conditions from that night: humid, with a lot of moisture in the air, causing the light to scatter and create a thin white haze that further reduced visibility at a distance. They added the sound of sporadic rain based on meteorological records. When Holman stood in front of the screen, displaying the reconstructed 3D model, and saw the recreated alley scene, he simply said, "Brian never clearly saw anyone." To be certain, they resimulated it from Brian's exact viewpoint based on his stated position. The 3D hologram recreated the shapes of 2 figures running past, just 2 black blocks with no facial features whatsoever. Even when the simulation placed the camera in a mode that amplified brightness 4 times beyond human vision, the images still only appeared as blurry, face-obscured shadows. Lena Moree, the team's forensic expert, posed the pivotal question: if this is what the human eye saw, how could Brian describe the eyes of the perpetrator? That question became a direct blow to the foundation of the 1981 trial. The team continued with technical analysis. They calculated the perpetrator's movement time based on average running speed, the distance from the alley to the main street, and Brian's line of sight. The result, the time Brian could actually see the two figures, was only about 0.9 to 1.3 seconds. Too short to identify a face, even under ideal lighting conditions. In the dark conditions of 1980, the chance of identification was virtually zero. Hallman requested that the team conduct a real-life recreation test to confirm the simulation. They selected an alley with a structure similar to the one behind Turner's house, installed a sodium light of the same wattage, positioned a person where Brian had stood, and had 2 people in dark clothing run past. The results were identical to the simulation. The observer could not describe faces, only see moving shadows. When they tried inserting a photo of Caleb Monroe into a virtual lineup, placing it next to images of the 2 running figures, the obvious truth emerged: there was no point in the simulated images that could cause Caleb's face to be mistaken for the perpetrator. It couldn't be mistaken because it couldn't be seen. Brian could not have identified anyone, and if Brian could not identify anyone, his entire 1980 statement became invalid. The official conclusion was recorded in the 3D simulation report submitted to DA Ava Lambert. Under no lighting or positional configuration consistent with 1980 conditions, could the witness have visually identified the suspect. This was the first time in nearly 30 years that the Louisiana justice system witnessed something it had never wanted to acknowledge. The sole identification used to convict Caleb Monroe was completely impossible in reality. Not flawed, not doubtful. Impossible. Lambert reviewed the report, flipping through each simulated image, then gently placed her hand on her forehead. She understood the implications. The 1981 conviction was based on a non-existent foundation, a mistake stamped by the law, a man convicted based on a statement that could not be true. She wrote at the end of the report, "The 1980 identification is completely invalidated." That conclusion became the first turning point in the investigation, the point marking where the truth began to separate from the darkness of 28 years of error. When the 1980 identification was invalidated, thanks to the 3D simulation, the Louisiana cold case team moved to the next step that the previous generation of investigators had been completely incapable of performing, using modern forensics to reanalyze the old physical evidence that had been overlooked or misinterpreted based on intuition. Reed Hallman requested that all remaining evidence, the shoes, jacket, wallet, soil samples from the shoe soles, and fabric fibers recovered from the jacket, be brought to the state forensic lab. The old evidence bags, sealed with faded brown tape, were opened under the pure white lights of the laboratory, where every speck of dirt and every fiber could now be analyzed with technology unimaginable in 1980. The first analysis Lena Moree performed was comparing the soil, something that had been dismissively concluded as ordinary mud. Lena used spectroscopic microscopy and mineral analysis to examine the structure of the soil stuck to Elias's shoe soles. When the mineral map appeared, she immediately noticed the anomaly. The sample contained a high concentration of red clay particles, characteristic of the southwestern Louisiana swamp region, particularly the area near Houma and Gray. More importantly, this red clay composition did not appear in the area around Elias's home, nor did it match any construction sites or paths in Uptown in 1980. This proved something that had been dismissed. Elias's shoes had contacted soil in a place far from New Orleans, the very region where the body was later found. But that red clay was not just characteristic of Terrebonne, it was also linked to a specific person, Reggie Doyle, a smuggler and long-haul driver active in the Houma area from 1979-1981, who frequently stopped at rest areas and container yards where this type of soil clung to the undercarriage of his truck. Doyle had been documented driving an old brown Ford Econoline, a vehicle very similar to the description given by witnesses on the night Elias disappeared. When Hallman reviewed the soil comparison and Doyle's activity map, he simply exclaimed, "We were looking in the wrong direction from the start." The second piece of evidence, the gray fabric fibers stuck to Elias's jacket, had been ignored by 1980 police due to lack of analysis technology. But with FTIR technology, Lena could determine that the fibers were polyester blended with nylon, used in the interior lining of commercial cargo vans from the late 1970s, the kind that long-haul drivers often modified for illegal hauling. When cross-referencing the vehicle material library provided by the Transportation Technical Department, Lena found the highest match, the lining in the cargo area of International Harvester and Ford Econoline trucks from 1976-1980, both models associated with local transport driver Terry Mays, who was also a close associate of Reggie Doyle. Terry Mays specialized in repairing vehicles and modifying cargo interiors for many long-haul drivers, especially those hauling illegal goods. The 1980 file faintly listed Mays's name in the people present at the repair yard near Elias's home, but since it wasn't treated as a kidnapping or murder case at the time, Mays was removed from the suspect list after 48 hours without full interrogation. Now, the fabric fiber on Elias's jacket, the only thing remaining after nearly 3 decades, was telling a completely different truth. Elias had come into contact with the interior of a cargo van on the night he disappeared. Not dragged on foot, not leaving voluntarily, not falling into a swamp. He had been put into a vehicle. When Hallman reviewed the fabric analysis results, he requested a comparison with mechanical records from the Terrebonne area between 1978-1982. The results confirmed Terry Mays was one of only 5 people in the region who had modified cargo areas with lining matching the found fiber. The team also re-examined Elias's shoes. Besides the red clay, the heel had arc-shaped scratches, marks typically appearing when shoes are dragged across a textured metal surface, like a worn cargo van floor. But the 1980 police, lacking crime scene knowledge, had viewed those scratches as from hitting rocks. Modern forensics completely reversed that conclusion. Finally, Elias's wallet, previously thought to have fallen on its own, was tested for touch spectroscopy. Though the DNA samples were too old for complete analysis, particle analysis revealed oak wood rot, red clay, and nylon fibers, all matching the environment of the cargo van in the gray parking lot, where Mays and Doyle often parked overnight. The evidence overlooked in 1980, under modern forensic light, all pointed in one direction, and that direction had nothing to do with Caleb Monroe. Red clay, Terrebonne Parish, Reggie Doyle's activity area. Fabric fibers, cargo van lining modified by Terry Mays. Shoe scratches, metal cargo floor. Wallet, Partica's gray truck parking lot. Each small piece, each fiber, each soil particle now told the same story. Elias had been abducted into a cargo van taken out of New Orleans and brought to the area where his body was found nearly 2 decades later. Forensics was no longer about confirming a suspect. Forensics had become the strongest witness, removing the dust of 1980 errors. And when Hallman placed all the reports on the table, he said a sentence that silenced the entire team: "The evidence has spoken. Now it's time we listen clearly." When the forensic results began converging on the same direction, the cargo van that had taken Elias out of New Orleans, Reed Hallman knew the Louisiana cold case team had to do something the 1980 police had never done: trace the vehicle, because the vehicle itself was the thread connecting the victim to the perpetrator. Starting from previously ignored witness reports, the team confirmed the initial description was surprisingly accurate: a brown cargo van with a long peeling paint streak from the cabin to the rear wheel, seen in the alley behind Elias's house around 9:30 p.m., matching the time the victim was taken. In 1980, police did not pursue the license plate even though a witness remembered the first 3 characters, but in 2008, the cold case team had an advantage: old vehicle registration records had been digitized. Lena Moret sat at the computer, accessing the Louisiana DMV archive system. She entered the known details: brown color, 1976, 1980 model, possibly modified cargo area, and especially the blurry plate characters, P6B or P68. The system returned a list of over 140 matching vehicles statewide in 1980, a large number but manageable. Reed divided the data into three categories: vehicles registered in Orleans Parish, vehicles registered in Terrebonne Parish, and vehicles owned by long-haul drivers. The third category alone narrowed the list to 15 vehicles, and among those 15, one name immediately caught Hallman's attention: Terry Mays. The person who had just appeared in the forensic fabric analysis. Mays owned a 1978 brown Ford Econoline E250 with a modified cargo area, registered in Houma, Terrebonne Parish. Maintenance records from 1979 showed the vehicle had peeling paint on the side from scraping a metal gate, matching the witness description. Lena continued filtering the data in 1980. Mays' vehicle was ticketed twice for illegal parking in the uptown New Orleans area, only 0.7 miles from Elias's home. This immediately shattered the old assumption that Mays had no reason to be in the area. Not only was there a reason, but it was documented in actual parking tickets that no one in 1980 bothered to cross-reference. Then came the clue that left the entire team breathless. In the 1980 registration list, there was exactly one brown cargo van with a plate starting with P6B 713, owned by Reggie Doyle, the very person the forensics had linked through the red clay traces tied to his activities. The two vehicles of Mays and Doyle matched nearly all clues: color, peeling paint streak, cargo type, physical traces, activity areas, and geographic connection to where Elias was found. But what chilled the team was a note in the 1980 report: Reggie Doyle, not related. A perfect alibi, self-provided by him. No one verified it, no one checked, no one went to the parking lot where he claimed the vehicle broke down. Worse, Doyle was never interrogated. Reed immediately requested a full cross-check of traffic tickets in the month Elias disappeared, and in a thin yellow file from Terrebonne Parish, they found the most critical detail: Doyle's vehicle repair receipt dated May 21st, one day after Elias disappeared. This proved the alibi. On the evening of May 20th, the vehicle was broken down, was a lie. The more likely truth: that night, the brown cargo van was running fine, and could very well have been used to take Elias out of Uptown. The cold case team decided to expand the route investigation. They recreated the travel simulation from Elias's alley to the burial site in Terrebonne. Took about 50-60 minutes by cargo van, reasonable if the perpetrator left right after 9:20 p.m. The route map matched in a chilling way. At this point, the question was no longer what vehicle did the perpetrator use, but who was behind the wheel of the brown cargo van that night. Reed requested a trace of Doyle's insurance and registration papers from 1979, 1981. In a yellow document, the team found a key detail: Terry Mays was co-signed on the cargo modification registration for Doyle's vehicle in early 1980. The two men, who had appeared separately in clues, were actually colleagues, working together at container yards, running the US 90 route together, repairing vehicles in gray, and both present in the Uptown area at the exact time Elias disappeared. The cold case team began reconstructing the evidence travel model, forced to acknowledge the brown cargo van was the crime vehicle. That van was the mobile crime scene. That van was the link between Uptown and Terrebonne. That van had appeared in front of witnesses and was ignored by 1980 police as an unimportant echo. When Reed looked at the final list after 3 weeks of data collection, it had narrowed to exactly two names: Reggie Doyle and Terry Mays, the only two people who owned or drove brown cargo vans matching all forensic traces, the only two who could have transported Elias over 30 miles undetected, the only two who appeared in every data layer ignored in 1980. And now, 28 years later, the two people the cold case team had traced as the origin of one of the biggest investigative errors in Louisiana history. The brown van, once thought to be just a faded, forgotten detail, had become the centerpiece. And for the first time in decades, the investigation was no longer revolving around Caleb Monroe. It was leading straight to the real perpetrator. The third witness interview took place in late 2009, just weeks after the Louisiana cold case team traced the brown cargo van and narrowed the suspect list to two names: Reggie Doyle and Terry Mays. When the forensic pieces, vehicle registration data, and geographic analysis had painted a picture completely opposite to the 1980 file, Reed Hallman knew there was still one critical gap to fill: the statement of the sole witness, Brian Talbot. Whether the old case collapsed or stood depended on decoding one question: what did Brian really see, and what had he been forced to see? Brian, in 2009, was no longer the young man living 2 houses away from Elias, as in 1980. He was nearly 60, living alone in a small house in suburban Jefferson Parish, in poor health with mild heart disease and anxiety disorder. When Hallman and forensic expert Lena Moret knocked on the door, Brian seemed surprised, but did not object, as if he knew this day would come, just not when. The small living room smelled of medicine and rotting wood, with faded old photos hanging on the walls. Brian sat down slowly, his hands clasped as if afraid they would tremble in front of the investigators. Hallman began calmly, "We're not here to accuse you. We need the truth. The truth that maybe you never had a chance to tell." Those words made Brian's eyes flicker. Something, perhaps guilt, perhaps fear, was stirring after nearly 3 decades. Hallman placed in front of him the colored printouts of the 3D simulation. Images of the 1980 alley, weak yellow streetlight, viewpoint from where Brian stood, and 2 figures running past in the darkness. When Brian leaned down to look, he said nothing for nearly 30 seconds. Then he took a deep breath, his voice breaking. "Yes, that's all it was, just shadows. I didn't see anyone's face." Hallman was not surprised, but he needed Brian to admit everything himself. "So why in the second lineup did you say person number 3 looked like the perpetrator?" Brian looked down at his hands, shifting slightly as if his hands were remembering the pressure of memory's handcuffs. "I didn't think so. I just did what I thought the police wanted me to do." Brian recounted that when called for the second lineup, he was so exhausted he couldn't distinguish real memory from what he had imagined during sleepless nights. Simmons, the young investigator at the time, had said, "Take a close look at number 3. See if he looks familiar," and those words stuck in his brain like a command. He feared that if he didn't pick someone, police would think he was hiding something. He feared they would come back more times. He feared being seen as uncooperative. And in that fear, Brian did the worst thing: "I picked the person I thought the police wanted me to pick." Those words caused the room to fall into absolute silence. Lena Moret sat up straight, sensing a historic moment unfolding before her eyes. Ullman continued gently, "Did you ever see Caleb Monroe's face that night?" Brian shook his head so hard the chair shook. "No, never. I never saw anyone's face in the alley. Just shadows. I didn't know who they were. I never knew." Then for the first time, Brian looked straight into Hallman's eyes. "I've thought about it for decades. I was afraid I caused an innocent person to be convicted. But back then, I was pressured. Not pressured with threats, but with looks, with tone of voice, with the way they asked questions. I felt I had to pick someone." When Hallman showed Brian the 3D simulation images again, he nodded. This is exactly what I saw. Nothing more, nothing less. No faces, no features, just blurry shadows." Brian's third statement, the first completely honest one, matched perfectly with the 3D simulation and lighting analysis. This was no longer a witness with conflicting memories. This was a witness whose perception had been manipulated. Hallman asked the final question: "If the lighting in 1980 had been brighter, do you think you could have identified anyone?" Brian shook his head. "Impossible. They moved too fast. And I was standing too far away. There was no way I could see their faces." When writing the official statement, Brian's hands shook so much he had to pause multiple times. He asked Hallman to read it back in full, to ensure every word matched what he had felt for 29 years. And before the cold case team left the house, he whispered one sentence: "Please, if you can fix what I did wrong." When the door closed, Hallman knew they had just received the final piece to dismantle the flawed foundation of the 1981 trial. Brian's statement, now aligned with lighting science, with 3D simulation, with visibility analysis, became the most critical nail in the conclusion. The 1980 identification was not just wrong, but impossible. And once the identification collapsed, the entire conviction of Caleb Monroe began to crumble from the roots. When Brian Talbot's third statement perfectly matched the 3D simulation and modern forensics, the Louisiana cold case team had no doubts left. Caleb Monroe had never appeared in that dark alley in 1980. And the identification from that year was merely the product of pressure and flawed procedures. Once Caleb was ruled out, the investigation immediately focused on two names that all the forensic, geographic, and vehicle registration data were unanimously pointing to: Reggie Doyle and Terry Mays. But to charge them, they needed something the 1980 file completely lacked: a motive. And it was precisely the search for that motive that led them to uncover a history of conflict that the police back then had never known about, because they had never seriously investigated it. The first piece emerged when Lena Moray reviewed the list of Elias's acquaintances from the seafood packing plant where he worked part-time in 1979. In an old note just 3 lines long, she spotted a name faintly circled: Doyle. Argument over October shipment. No one had ever read it carefully. No one had asked why the name of a long-haul truck driver like Doyle appeared on Elias's acquaintance list. When the cold case team tracked down former co-workers from the plant in 1979, 1980, they spoke to an elderly man named Harold Stokes, who had been the warehouse manager. Harold, after a few minutes of trying to recall, recounted that there had been a minor scuffle between Elias and a long-haul driver named Doyle in the fall of 1979. The incident involved a shipment of Doyle's that was marked with the wrong weight, resulting in him not being paid in full. Doyle blamed Elias, saying, "You cost me money," and threatened him right in the middle of the warehouse yard. Elias protested because he wasn't on duty that day, but Doyle didn't believe him and used harsh words, to the point that Harold had to step in and intervene. At the time, no one thought it was a big deal. But the cold case team knew that many kidnapping murders start from small confrontations, especially with individuals who have violent tendencies like Doyle. Digging into his criminal record, they discovered Doyle had been arrested 3 times for assault, had once vandalized a coworker's vehicle after an argument, and was frequently involved in smuggling contraband. Even more alarming, despite his record, Doyle had never been questioned by New Orleans police in the Elias case, entirely because they had been looking in the wrong direction from the start. The second piece came from Terry Mays. When the cold case team interviewed Mays's former colleagues at the gray container yard, they heard a detail that made everything clearer. Mays and Doyle had worked joint runs together in early 1980 on several unregistered nighttime shipments. These runs followed US 90, the very route that forensics and travel simulations indicated the perpetrator likely used to take Elias to Terrebonne. An anonymous witness even confirmed that Doyle had bragged about how he knew every road from uptown to Houma without anyone noticing, and that Mays was the only guy I trust to fix my truck. With 2 suspects appearing in the same environment, the same route, the same type of vehicle, and the same forensic traces, Hallman began reconstructing the entire picture, and the clues suddenly lit up as if they were being placed in their correct positions for the first time in 29 years. 1 red clay on the soles of Elias's shoes, Terrebonne area, exactly where Doyle and Mays operated. 2 fabric fragment matching the lining of the truck bed that Mays repaired. 3 Doyle's brown Econoline with license plate P6B, the 3 characters the witness had recalled. 4. Metal noise heard at 9:25, very similar to the sound of a truck bed door being slammed shut. 5. Strange man at the gas station near the time Elias disappeared, matching the height and build description of Doyle from old file photos. 6. Elias's wallet with particles of rotted oak wood, exactly the type of wood Mays used to line truck beds for soundproofing. 7. Burial site located near the route Mays and Doyle frequently drove. 8. 1979 conflict, providing the rare motive that police in 1980 had never known about. 9. Doyle's fake alibi about his broken-down truck on the evening of May 20th, disproved by a repair invoice dated May 21st. Each piece of data, once isolated, once dismissed, once deemed unimportant, now formed a clear red thread. Elias had fallen into the hands of two long-haul drivers, men who had the means, the time, the route, a prior argument, and the skills to conceal traces. In 1980, police failed to recognize this connection because they had never treated the disappearance as a criminal case. They didn't trace vehicles. They didn't trace routes. They didn't trace routes. They didn't trace criminal records. They didn't trace work relationship. But now, the cold case team not only saw it but witnessed every piece fitting together with chilling precision. When Hallman looked up at the analysis board, covered with photos of trucks, route maps, images of Elias, and files on Mays and Doyle, he said a sentence that left the entire meeting room silent for several long seconds, like holding a breath. We have identified the real perpetrators, not by guesswork, not by memory, but by the truth. And from that moment, the investigation was no longer a journey to find the truth. It was a journey to confront the truth that Louisiana had misseen for 3 decades. The Louisiana cold case team decided to take the crucial step, searching Terry Mays's old brown pickup truck, the vehicle registered in New Orleans in 1980, which had passed through 3 owners before sitting idle in a rusted tin shed in Lafourche Parish for over 10 years. They had to obtain a search warrant from the court, and when the judge approved it based on the new chain of forensic evidence provided, Hallman knew this could be the most significant moment in the nearly 3-decade-long investigation. On the day of the vehicle inspection, the mobile forensics team set up temporary barriers around the shed, opened the heavy rusted tin door, revealing Mays's 1978 Ford F-150, covered in dust with patchy brown paint, faded in places to almost silver white under the industrial lights. They began with the photography protocol, then opened the doors, the hinges creaking with a prolonged sound, like a noise trapped since 1980, finally being released. Inside the cabin, thick dust covered the dashboard, but nothing unusual except a few old receipts and an empty toolbox. However, what they were waiting for was in the back, the truck bed, which the cold case team believed was where Elias had been confined or transported on the night he disappeared. When the forensic lights were turned on, beams swept every corner of the bed, and immediately they noticed the rotted oak wood lining the bottom identical to the type found on Elias's wallet. To ensure objectivity, they carefully used swabs to collect dust particles and tiny wood fibers from cracks in the bed floor. But when they switched to luminol, no one could have predicted what happened. As the solution was sprayed on the wooden surface, the first few seconds were silent. Then suddenly faint blue-green spots appeared in the left corner of the bed. Dim, small, but clearly the characteristic chemical reaction of trace blood. "Sample it now," Hallman said, his voice low and steady, but unable to hide the surge of what investigators call the irreversible turn, the point of no return for the truth. The forensics team scraped the wood, collected each sample portion, marked 6 different locations, then continued scanning along the sides of the bed. In the metal crevice near the hinge, they found the second critical item, a pale gray fabric fiber, stuck in the gap, less than half an inch long, but with intact structure. Preliminary on-site analysis with a magnifying glass showed polyester cotton blend material, identical to the type of work shirt Elias often wore at the seafood plant. This fiber was lodged horizontally, as if it had been forcefully pulled and torn from the edge of a shirt. No one spoke for several minutes. Even Hallman, Ava Lambert, or Lena Moret, the one known for rarely letting emotions interfere with work. They just looked at each other, as if everyone understood this was no longer suspicion, no longer hypothesis, no longer inference. This was physical evidence, inadvertently preserved for decades, lying dormant in a vehicle that only those involved would know had once been near the area where Elias disappeared. When the trace blood samples were sent to the lab in Baton Rouge, the initial analysis results showed it was human blood, type O, matching Elias Turner's blood type from his 1977 medical records. Modern DNA testing was needed for absolute confirmation, but given the age-degraded samples, the chemical reaction and blood type alone were the biggest piece yet. Holman called it the breakthrough moment, the breakthrough the entire team had been waiting for over many months. In fact, it wasn't just a breakthrough, it was the first technical evidence that completely refuted the entire 1980 investigation conclusions and pierced through nearly 3 decades of errors. Mays's pickup, which no one in 1980 had ever considered, now became a mobile crime scene, like a time capsule holding the truth that only 21st century forensics could peel away. As night fell, the tin shed was sealed, the vehicle transported to the evidence storage facility in a locked refrigerated container, and the cold case team stood silent for a few seconds. They didn't need to say it, but everyone understood. They had touched Elias Turner for the first time since the night he vanished. And from the moment those trace blood spots glowed blue under the luminol, the Elias Turner case was no longer an investigative hypothesis. It had become a clear indictment aimed straight at 2 names, Reggie Doyle and Terry Mays. The arrest warrants were signed by DA Ava Lambert in early July 2009, right after the degraded but still sufficiently comparable DNA results with Elias Turner's blood profile were returned, and the entire Louisiana cold case team mobilized for one single day, the day that for 29 years justice had stood still. First was Reggie Doyle, 58 years old, arrested at a container parking lot on the outskirts of Gretna, where he worked as a laborer unloading pallets and patching tires for a small transport company. When the agents suddenly appeared, Doyle only had time to look around once, his deep-set eyes cold and blank, like the years he had lived without anyone knowing. Holman stood right in front when the cuffs clicked around his wrists and read him his Miranda rights. At first, Doyle denied everything, muttering that he never met Elias, that it's just a misunderstanding by the law. But once brought into the interrogation room in New Orleans, his attitude began to shift. The investigators presented each piece of forensic evidence, the red clay matching his operational area, the wood particles, the polyester fabric fragment, and most importantly, the trace blood in Terry Mays's truck bed that he knew he had stood in on the night of May 20th, 1980. When the luminol photos glowing blue were placed in front of him, Doyle flinched slightly, then tried to regain his defiant look. But when Holman calmly asked, "Reggie, do you want to be tried for both acts, kidnapping and murder?" a wavering appeared in his eyes. Not fear, but realization that there was no way out. Over an hour later, Doyle began speaking in fragmented sentences, as if scratched memories were being pulled up from the bottom of a 29-year-old pit. "I just meant to scare him. Just scare him. I didn't mean to kill. He said Elias cost me money at the plant in '79, that the kid always looked at me like he was better, that he just wanted him to apologize." Doyle admitted to being in Mays's truck bed when the two blocked Elias as he entered the alley, that he grabbed Elias's shirt and shoved him into the bed, while Mays closed the door. When asked if Elias was still alive when the truck left Uptown, Doyle was silent for nearly a minute before nodding, a nod that drained the air from the room. This admission matched the forensics: blood spatter direction, adhesion positions, torn fabric, all framing the exact movement sequence the simulation had reconstructed. Meanwhile, Terry Mays, now 61 years old, was arrested at a small garage in Houma, where he repaired vehicles for locals. Mays didn't resist, just sighed and asked one single question. "The 1980 case, right?" When told yes, he hung his head, as if he had been waiting for this for a long time. But unlike Doyle, Mays didn't confess immediately. He remained silent for the first 4 hours in the interrogation room, staring straight at the wall, hands trembling slightly, but eyes empty. Ava Lambert decided to play the strongest evidence, the fabric fragment from the truck bed, matching 98%, with Elias's uniform shirt sample, achieved through new generation fiber analysis technology. Mays bowed his head, exhaled a long breath, as if releasing a 29-year burden from his chest. Then he began confessing the parts Doyle had tried to avoid. Mays said Doyle was the one who pulled Elias into the truck, but he was the one who drove the entire way to Terrebonne. That when they stopped in a remote wooded area north of Houma, Elias tried to scream and bang hard on the bed walls, forcing him to turn off the lights and pull over. He was still alive, Mays said in a trembling voice. I remember clearly because my hands were still muddy when I opened the bed. When Hallman asked what happened next, Mays didn't answer right away. He raised his hands to cover his face, then said one single sentence. Doyle told me to do it so he wouldn't come back. No one in the interrogation room needed him to say the word kill. That sentence was enough to complete the entire logical chain. Mays admitted to digging a shallow grave with a shovel in the woods, under the yellow lights of the pickup, but he did not directly confirm the final act. However, forensics had already clarified that Elias was struck hard on the head from behind, with force consistent with Doyle's height and the angle from the simulation study. Police recorded the entire confession, combined it with the blood samples, fabric, and geographic evidence, and the report was sent to D.A. Lambert that same night. When Lambert stood at the microphone during the press conference that night, she said a sentence broadcast across Louisiana, with forensic evidence, matching confessions, and the truth buried for 3 decades. We declare that the Elias Turner investigation has entered its final stage. Reggie Doyle and Terry Mays have been arrested and will be prosecuted. That same night, at Orleans Parish Detention, Doyle and Mays were placed in separate cells, and for the first time since 1980, the Elias Turner file had 2 names considered the true perpetrators. 2 men who thought they had escaped the truth forever. The 2009 trial took place in the large courtroom of the Orleans District Court, where for nearly 3 decades, Elias Turner's name had been mentioned like a ghost of investigative failure and prolonged injustice. The spectator seats were packed. Elias's family, Caleb Monroe's relatives, Louisiana state media, and even New Orleans residents who had lived through the turbulent 1980s. The 2 defendants, Reggie Doyle and Terry Mays, were led into the courtroom through separate doors, wearing worn orange prison jumpsuits, their expressions different. Doyle maintained a stubborn glare and turned away from the cameras, while Mays looked exhausted, his eyes clearly marked with weary resignation. The trial began with the opening statement from D.A. Ava Lambert, who in just 1 year had overturned an entire file that had gathered dust for nearly 30 years. She stood straight, hands on the wooden podium, voice low and firm, without needing to raise it, because what she held was stronger than any words. Today we will prove what Louisiana should have known since 1980. Elias Turner did not disappear. He was kidnapped, assaulted, and murdered. And we have the evidence to prove who did it. After the opening, the prosecution presented modern forensics' first luminol results, images of Mays's pickup bed with faint blue-green spots. Blood analysis confirming type O, comparison of Elias's shirt fabric with the fragment in the bed. Red clay on Elias's wallet, matching the area where remains were found. Each exhibit, each photo, each comparison chart was projected on the large screen, leaving the courtroom breathless. Hofstadter, the forensics expert, called from Baton Rouge, explained clearly to the jury. There can be no random coincidence. These samples together tell one single story. Elias was present in defendant Terry Mays's truck bed. Next was the reconstructed timeline, investigating every minute from 9 o'clock to 10 p.m. on May 20th, 1980. But this time, the correct timeline, not the sloppy 1980 version. Hallman presented the 3D simulation diagram, recreating the scene of Elias sitting on the porch, entering the alley, then being blocked by the brown pickup in the exact direction the witness had described. The virtual camera showed the dim streetlight glow, dim enough that Brian Talbot, standing 25 meters away, could never have clearly seen the perpetrator's face. This was confirmed by physical light simulation and line-of-sight trajectory analysis. Brian also testified as a witness. His voice trembled, but was clear. "Back then I thought I had to help the police. They kept saying I must have seen someone. I was persuaded to the point of believing my memory was clear. But I never saw anyone's face." A direct blow to the only foundation ever used to convict Caleb Monroe. When the prosecution declared, "The sole witness has recanted. The 1980 identification is invalid," the jury scribbled furiously, while Caleb, sitting in the front row, slightly bowed his head, shoulders shaking from some unclear emotion, knowing he had lived 28 years in darkness because of this mistake. But the heaviest blow was yet to come. The cold case team played the recorded confessions of Doyle and Mays. Doyle's voice came first, cold, defiant, but with faltering segments when cornered. "I just meant to scare him, because that kid cost me money at the plant. I didn't think he'd fight back so hard." Then Mays, weary and dazed, "When I opened the bed he was still alive. He begged. Doyle told me to make sure he wouldn't come back." The courtroom fell deathly silent. No one moved, no one dared cough, and the prosecution repeated what everyone was thinking. These two confessions match the forensics. They cannot be faked. They cannot be invented. When Doyle's defense attorney countered, they tried to focus on the age of the physical evidence, degraded DNA, faded witness memories, and Doyle not admitting to killing Elias. But Ava Lambert stood up, lightly tapping her hand on the table, saying, "Science does not lie, blood does not lie, geography does not lie, and Elias Turner could not have buried himself in Terrebonne Parish." On sentencing day, the courtroom was packed. The judge read each sentence slowly, as if to etch it into Louisiana history. Reggie Doyle, for first-degree kidnapping, first-degree murder. The court sentences life imprisonment without parole. Doyle showed no reaction, just staring down at his cuffed hands. A cold ending like the night he had confined Elias in the truck bed. Terry Mays for aiding and abetting kidnapping resulting in death, and for destruction of the victim's body, the court sentences 40 years imprisonment. Mays nodded, as if the sentence was something he had long accepted. Then the judge looked toward Caleb Monroe, and the entire courtroom held its breath. Based on new evidence, modern forensics, serious flaws in witness identification, and the confessions of the two defendants, the court declares Mr. Caleb Monroe absolutely innocent. The court apologizes for the years stolen from him. Sobs broke out from several corners of the room. Holman closed his eyes for a few seconds. Ava Lambert bowed her head in a belated gesture of sympathy. And the 2009 trial ended with a heavy reality. Justice had arrived, but it arrived 29 years late, and carried with it irreparable loss. After the verdict was announced, DA Ava Lambert took only 3 weeks to complete the final investigative report on the disappearance and murder of Elias Turner, a nearly 200-page document that was signed and submitted to the Louisiana Department of Justice. This was the final step before the case file would be permanently closed. But more than that, it was a comprehensive autopsy of the mistakes that had caused an innocent young man to vanish 29 years earlier, and forced another, Caleb Monroe, to carry the burden of a wrongful conviction for nearly 3 decades. The report opened with the sentence, "If justice arrives late, that too is a form of injustice." And from that line, Lambert dove straight into the hardest part to swallow: 7 serious errors in the 1980 investigation. Errors that not only destroyed the Elias Turner case, but also served as a classic example of what happens when an investigation is driven by intuition rather than evidence. Error 1, failing to treat the disappearance as a criminal case from the outset. New Orleans police in 1980 received the missing person report at 10:45 p.m., but did not raise the alert level, did not secure the area, did not collect initial trace evidence, and assumed that adults have the right to walk away. This allowed footprints, tire tracks, and any physical evidence in the alley, things that could have told the entire story, to be wiped out overnight. Error 2, relying excessively on the vague statement of the sole eyewitness. Brian Talbot did not see anyone's face, yet he was led to believe he had. Police did not check lighting conditions, did not analyze the angle of view, did not measure distance, and did not assess the reliability of memory under panic. This became the foundation for every subsequent distortion. Error 3. A procedurally flawed lineup, directly suggesting the position number. The original file was vague, but 29 years later, Brian admitted that an investigator had prompted him to take a close look at number 3. This was a serious violation of identification standards, making Caleb's wrongful identification an inevitable consequence. Error 4. Constructing an unverified timeline, yet treating it as core evidence. The 1980 timeline contained multiple illogical gaps. The time Elias left the porch did not match. When neighbors heard noises, the perpetrator's travel distance did not fit the route. Yet police ignored all of it to preserve a simple story. Elias walked into the alleys, encountered Caleb was harmed. Error 5. Failing to pursue the related vehicle. The brown pickup was completely ignored. A witness heard a metallic sound like a tailgate closing. Another reported seeing the shadow of a brown vehicle. But police never searched vehicle registrations in the area, never questioned trucking companies, and never focused on long-haul drivers, the very group far more likely to commit such a crime than anyone else. Error 6. Failing to properly collect or preserve physical evidence. Elias's clothing, wallet, and shoes were not analyzed for fibers, not tested for soil comparison, not examined for cut marks, not checked for bodily fluids. Even though 1980 forensics were limited, proper collection procedures could still have preserved evidence for future analysis. Many samples were even lost in storage. Error 7. Investigating based on assumption rather than evidence. From a minor disagreement between Caleb and Elias, police quickly concluded Caleb had motive, and every subsequent investigative step was distorted to fit that presumption. This was a textbook example of confirmation bias. Lambert wrote in the report, "They were not looking for the truth. They were looking for reasons to reinforce what they already believed." After listing the errors, the report moved to professional lessons learned, a section considered the most important in the document. The lessons included: 1. Every adult missing person case must be evaluated from a criminal perspective, especially within the first 3 hours. 2. Lineups must be conducted double-blind, without suggestion, without mentioning numbers, and without describing features before identification. 3. All eyewitness statements must be cross-checked with lighting and visibility simulations. 4. Timelines must be built using actual measured data, not generalized from memory. 5. Evidence must be sealed according to interagency preservation standards to serve future forensics. 6. When there is no body, investigators must not lock into a single theory, especially one based on gut feeling. 7. Vehicles, routes, and criminal patterns must be thoroughly checked, especially when the crime occurs near transportation corridors. Lambert did not hide her frustration in the report's conclusion: Louisiana cannot allow a case like Elias Turner to happen again. There is no room for deficient investigations, no room for improper identifications, no room for bias. We must place evidence above any intuition. On December 18, 2009, the case file was closed with the final line: Elias Turner, victim. Justice served on September 14, 2009. 2 stamps were firmly applied to the page, one from DA Ava Lambert and one from Cold Case Unit Chief John Holman. 29 years after the night Elias walked into the dark uptown alley, Louisiana finally completed a circle that should have closed in the previous century. The file was placed in the Resolved Cases storage section, renumbered, and officially sealed. No further prosecutions, no further wrongful suspicions, no more unanswered questions. Only the truth, late, painful, but finally emerging from the dust of 3 decades. The story of the Elias Turner case is not just the tragedy of an individual who was abducted and murdered, or the destroyed life of Caleb Monroe. It also reflects a very real issue in American society today. Justice does not operate correctly on its own unless the people responsible for each investigative step take accountability, with honesty, transparency, and scientific skepticism. The 1980 investigation committed 7 fatal errors. Police were dismissive of the missing person report, relied on a witness's hazy memory, conducted a flawed lineup, built an unverified timeline, ignored information about the brown pickup, failed to consider violent offenders like Reggie Doyle, and allowed prejudice to steer the investigation in the wrong direction. Those mistakes mirror a phenomenon still common in many American communities today: blind trust in the intuition of authorities, especially in resource-strapped places like 1980s New Orleans. The lessons are clear. In modern society, we all need to understand that science, procedure, and transparency are the foundation of justice, not emotion or pressure to find someone to blame. Caleb Monroe's 28 years of wrongful imprisonment is a stark reminder that in today's America, where wrongful convictions still occur, communities must ask questions when something doesn't add up. We need to support the use of modern forensics, body cameras, 3D simulations, and non-suggestive identification procedures to ensure no one is convicted simply because it seems to fit. Additionally, the story underscores the importance of not dismissing small details: a fiber fragment, red clay soil, or Doyle's uncontrolled behavior 29 years earlier. All helped bring the truth back to light. In everyday life, this reminds us that truth rarely lies in compelling narratives or fleeting intuition. It lies in specific facts, careful observation, and the willingness to admit we might have been wrong. The best way to avoid repeating the mistakes of 1980 is to foster a society that asks questions, verifies information, and takes responsibility even for what seem like the smallest things. If you want to keep following in-depth case-breaking stories like the Elias Turner case, please hit subscribe so you don't miss any new videos. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next journey to uncover the truth.